The third meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. We have apologies today from George Adam. The first item on our agenda is an evidence session on the financial situation at the University of Dundee. And can I welcome Professor Ian Gillespie, former Principal of the University of Dundee. Professor Gillespie will get straight into questions, if that is okay. The Gillies report was damning, but particularly scathing about you as an individual, your leadership, your management, your entire time at the University of Dundee. What do you say in response to that report, and what do you say to the staff who have lost their jobs, whose jobs are under threat, and the students whose studies have been disrupted because of the way you managed that university for so many years?
Well, let me start off with an apology to the staff and students. I think staff and students deserve better than they've had with the management and the governance of the University of Dundee over quite some time, but particularly over the period of 2024. And that's a heartfelt apology for a university that I love and a city that I hugely respect. The second thing to say is the Gillies report clearly is a forensic piece of work that shows some of the challenges, some of the difficulties, long-term and also some of the short-term difficulties at the University of Dundee. And I appreciate over the next 3 hours we will go into that in a great deal of detail. As far as the way it's presented me and my management style, that's not something that I recognise. I think as a leader, as a manager of the university, I was always, and will continue to be insofar as I'm able, a champion of the University of Dundee and the people in it and what it tries to achieve. And I don't recognise some of the characteristics of my management style, but again, convey that I'm sure that we'll get into that in detail.
So are you contesting the findings of the Pamela Gillies report? Well,
I think there's the findings of the Gillies report which are very specific and forensic around some of the issues on the financial management of the organisation. And as I say, I'm sure we'll get into that, I hope, in a great deal of detail in this conversation. But in terms of how it represents me and my management style, that's not something that I recognise. I think that's a different level of comments to saying that I'm contesting the forensic analysis. The forensic analysis is what the forensic analysis is.
How can the forensic analysis therefore be correct in the financial situation, but the same person who did the forensic analysis into your leadership style, in your view, got it wrong? I mean, she says you tended to control the narrative of the court and elsewhere, consistently painted a picture that all was well at the university, frequently demonstrated hubris, dangerous over-self-confidence and complacency, often in combination with arrogance. You had an overbearing leadership style, behaviours and dislike of potentially awkward confrontations and questioning. I mean, it wasn't just one remark. I mean, she rips apart your character.
She does, and I don't recognise it.
How could she get that so wrong then? And she's not the only... Did you watch her evidence session yesterday?
I did not. I was travelling to come here.
You were travelling yesterday. You travel a lot. We'll come on to that in a bit. But, I mean, the evidence session yesterday was not supportive of your leadership style. Were those witnesses all wrong yesterday?
Oh, I don't know what the witnesses said yesterday.
Well, I'm saying
I didn't see it.
They criticised your leadership style.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Why are you the only person that thinks you were a good leader, whereas Pamela Gillies makes it very clear in her report that your style of leadership was part of the problem here?
Well, I think the problems at the University of Dundee were based in some long-term financial challenges, and there were certainly cultural challenges at Dundee. When I joined Dundee, 4 years before I left, when I joined Dundee, Dundee had gone through some very, very difficult times with its previous leadership and also with its finances. And one of the things that had happened at Dundee is Dundee had, as I say, lost its confidence, lost its direction. And what I, plus others in the senior team, the executive and the leadership team and beyond, tried to do was build a sense of direction, strategy and confidence at that university. And that required some robust conversations and some difficult decisions. And I led many of these, not all of them, because it's a team game running a university. But I led a number of these conversations, some of them which were not always popular with everyone.
So one of her analyses of your behaviour and leadership characteristics is you consistently painted a picture that all was well at the university. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I think what I presented at the university was based on the information that I had available to me.
OK, so just on that, on the 28th of February last year, you told the whole university that the university was moving into a surplus after a decade of financial deficits. That was a lie, wasn't it, when you said that?
Well, it was perhaps incorrect, but it wasn't a lie.
OK. If it was incorrect, and you said it in full knowledge, as Gillies tells us, that the principal was aware that there was an £8 million hole in the financial year 24 budget, that was a lie.
No. What we were looking for was a betterment, and betterment was through not doing some of the things that would otherwise have been done. So no, there was no lie, there was no mendacity there. It may have been incorrect, and I accept that it was incorrect. I accept that I didn't have a full picture.
You did.
Well, I didn't.
At the time, the principal was aware that there was an £8 million hole in the financial year 24 budget. At the same time, you were telling the entire university that it was moving into a surplus after a decade of financial deficits. You may say that is incorrect. I believe if you said that, which is clearly incorrect, in knowledge of an £8 million deficit, you lied to the university and you were painting a rosy picture that all was well in the university, which is one of the characteristics you have been criticised for in the Gillies report.
Well, I think what I was trying to do with the university always was present what I understood to be the reality and the truth. And I clearly did not understand that there was the gap there was. But there was no lie, there was no mendacity in that. Error, yes, I accept error. I accept that the financial information that the executive group was working with, that they understood, and the financial information that the court understood was not correct and not underpinning underlying financial challenges. But it wasn't a lie. Wrong, yes.
I can't believe you're saying that, and I wholly disagree with you. Do you accept ultimate responsibility as Principal and Vice-Chancellor for what is in here? You've said with the investigation in the financial element of the report you don't contest in any way. It is damning and completely eviscerates you and your senior colleagues in the university. Do you accept the ultimate responsibility because you were in charge over this period?
Well, Convener, I've already accepted the ultimate responsibility.
Well, no, to be very clear, but just as for a moment, you were saying how as a group, as a team, as an organisation, but the buck stops with you. Do you accept that you are ultimately responsible?
I accept the buck stops with me, which is why, at the end of last year, I left.
Okay. How did you leave? How did you let the university know that you were leaving?
The university was advised by the Chair of Court, which is what the Chair of Court preferred.
And how did you advise the Chair of the Court?
The Chair of Court and I had a conversation over a weekend, and the Chair of Court informed me that she and numbers of her colleagues had no confidence in my future leadership, and we came to a discussion that I would resign. And
how did you formally submit your resignation?
I had a conversation with her, and then I sent her an email confirming it.
Well, the Courier newspaper is reporting this morning you sent a text message. Did you send a text message to resign?
I'm fairly sure I sent an email.
The Courier's fairly sure you sent a text message, which is why they ran the story this morning.
I think the Courier might not be correct in that, but it's possible I did. I don't now recall. Okay. I don't now recall. But let me be clear, Kavira. I had had a conversation with the Chair of Court, with the Deputy Chair of Court, and we had agreed that I would resign. And I was asked, rightly, to send a message to notify formally that I would indeed resign, and I did that. And I cannot, with my hand in my heart, now, I think I sent an email, but I cannot, with my hand in my heart, say whether it was an email or a text message. It could have been a text message. I don't think so. I think it was an email.
Okay. I think I would remember that ending my career at a university and how I did it, and I think I would hope it would be done in a proper way. But do you know what I thought when I read that story this morning? And whether it was an email or a text message, I read that, and the only thing I thought about you was you were a coward. You couldn't go back to the university and face the staff who were losing their jobs, face the students whose studies were so badly disrupted. You just created this mess and walked away into the sunset. Is that right?
Well, that's a pretty damning interpretation of what happens.
It's how I feel from reading that and seeing everything about you.
Okay, but whether I'm a coward or whether I'm not a coward, that's for other people to comment on, not for me. I don't think I'm a coward. But I resigned in the way that the Chair of Courts and the Deputy Convener of Court preferred that I did.
What payoff did you get for the mess you created in walking away?
Well, it's a matter of public record that my contract stipulated that was given 6 months' basic salary on resignation, and that's what the university, in the fullness of time, paid me.
Do you think you deserve it?
That was my contractual obligation. It was their contractual obligation and mine.
And my question is, do you deserve it?
Well, that's a very loaded question, Convener.
It's a very simple, straightforward question. Let's be clear, it's over £150,000 to walk away from a university you almost destroyed. Did you deserve £150,000 for doing that?
Now, Convener, I take overall management responsibility because I was the principal for what happened at the University of Dundee. But I push back against I almost destroyed it. I think what happened was the university found itself, and I hope we get into some of the detail of this, found itself in an invidious financial situation. And my departure was agreed with the Chair of Courts and with the Convener. I could have stayed.
You've told me,
I could have stayed and worked with colleagues to try and recover the situation. But the Chair of Court and the Deputy Convener preferred that I departed.
So were you disappointed?
And their message to me in departing was, when you depart, we will honour the contract and we'd like you to depart immediately, which is what I did.
So were you disappointed? Did you genuinely believe if the Chair of the Court and others hadn't asked you to resign, you could have turned this around? Were you the right man to solve the problems that you'd created?
Well, they obviously thought I wasn't.
But did you think you were?
I was prepared to have the conversation if they wanted, if they thought that was appropriate. And they didn't, so.
You've not said one way or the other whether you think you deserve that £150,000 plus payoff. Given everything that's gone on, everything you've hopefully read, even though you didn't watch your evidence yesterday, everything you've heard from your former colleagues, from students who trusted you to lead their university, at any point have you considered paying that money back?
That was a contractual obligation from the university, from my employer, to me to move.
And at any point did you consider that you had created this mess, you didn't deserve it, so you were going to pay that money back?
At many points, I regret many of the decisions that were taken across the course of my tenure in the University of Dundee.
But you don't regret them enough to pay back £150,000?
Well, £150,000, of course, was the cost of the university. It wasn't what I gained. But no, I'm not going to pay the money out. It was not in my my thought process to repay a contractual obligation to me from my work at the university.
I want to come into some of the specific details before I go to other members. An area we discussed at length yesterday was the covenant breach. What was your awareness of the breach of the covenant and your responsibilities as Principal Vice-Chancellor, but also, according to the Scottish Funding Council's guidance, the accountable officer?
So my knowledge of this was very poor, very weak. So first of all, the first time I was aware of there being a challenge to our covenants in 2023 was when I read it in the Gillies report. That had never been reported.
Sorry, say that again, because I can't believe what you've just said.
Well,
so just say it again.
The first time I was aware of a deviation, a requirement to shift on our covenant, that we hadn't met one of our covenants in 2023. The first time I was aware of that was when I read it in the Gillies report.
How can that be the case if you are the accountable officer? Were people not telling you the truth? Were they withholding information from you? Or were you not in the country or at the university enough to hear these concerns?
Well, I was certainly in the country and at the university enough to hear concerns. This was never, ever reported to me. To my knowledge, it was never reported to the Finance Committee.
OK, carry on.
The 2024 breach, pardon me, came up in a conversation that I had with the Finance Director after he had resigned, and I was doing some of the exit conversations. And it came up because I asked him, can you please just take me through what how our covenant tests look? What are our covenant tests? How do they look? Where are we performing? This is 45 minutes into a conversation with the Finance Director. It was a conversation which I was having together with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, with the Finance Director. And at that point, the Finance Director mentioned to me that one of the covenant tests would need to be rescheduled, and he was about to talk to the banks on this. And I was, to say the least, surprised by this.
Sorry, Professor Gillespie, your evidence doesn't match up. You're saying it's on his exit interview.
No, I'm saying it's one of the discussions we're having as he's leaving, not his exit interview.
Okay.
So I don't think of this as at the very, very end of...
Okay. So this is September, October time?
September, October time.
Okay.
I couldn't, in my evidence to the Gillies inquiry, I was pretty clear. I couldn't remember the exact dates.
Okay.
But it was around then, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I know that it was, what I told the Gillies inquiry was this was roughly 2 weeks prior to the Finance and Policy Committee meeting in the autumn. And this was the first that I had heard of any challenge.
So that makes it late September, early October, to be clear.
I don't have to...
well, if you'd watched the evidence session yesterday, you would know that the Finance Committee met in early to mid-October. Therefore, if it was 2 weeks prior, it must be early October or late September.
Right. So that was the first time that I had heard, together with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, from the Finance Director, that there was any issue at all with our covenants. And as it happened, within a day or two, I was going to London for Universities UK meeting, and I met one of our court members who is more expert on this than I am, and I asked him, how much should I worry about this? And I made sure that, and what I was told was if it's simply a rescheduling, that's probably not much of a concern if it's an accounting issue. So this was taken to the Finance and Policy Committee in a report from the Finance Director, which reported on this at the time. And I asked the Finance Director to make sure that the necessary reporting, including to Scottish Funding Council, was done.
So did you know at that point you were the one that had to report it?
Well, I wasn't specifically aware that I was the one that had to report it, but I was aware that it needed to be reported.
And you were the accountable officer? And
I was the accountable officer. And I assumed, wrongly, that that piece of work would be done by finance, which was a normal practice, and then it would be passed on my behalf to the Scottish Funding Council. What I didn't do was chase that up, and that was a mistake.
When did you tell the court? If you found out about this in late September, you must, because we've heard earlier, you text, you phoned the chair of the court, you must have picked up the phone straight away and said, we've got a problem here.
Well, because I was assured that this was simply an accounting.
No. You weren't assured straight away because you travelled to London before you were assured by someone.
Well, I was assured by the
hold
finance
on,
director.
Professor Gillespie. Well, first of all, if you'd watched yesterday, you would have been very clear that the finance director was totally out of his depth in this area. He didn't feel that he had the required expertise to deal with the covenant. So just listening to him yesterday, I accepted he would not be passing on advice on this issue because he was seeking advice himself. So I'm not sure how you can put this all on him. You're the accountable officer, you're in charge, you're the principal, and by the sound of things, you weren't that worried about it. You travelled down to London, you had an ad hoc conversation about it. This was a major breach of the finances within your university. You hold a very senior position, not just in your university, but universities across Scotland at that time. And are you telling us you did not inform your own court, who are in charge of governance, about this issue?
I informed the Finance and Policy Committee.
But not the court?
The Finance and Policy Committee. On which body the Chair of Court, as well as Chair of Finance Committee and the Deputy Chair sit.
And you found out in late September, early October. Why then did it take to mid-November to contact the Funding Council to alert them?
I don't have an answer to that question. I do not know. That should have been done then.
But it should have been done by you.
Well, of course, my name should be on the...
No, you should do it. It's not someone typing up a bit of paper and asking you to sign it. This is your role, your responsibility that you had been entrusted with by the Scottish Funding Council, who give millions of pounds to your university and others. They stipulate that the principal is the accountable officer, to ensure it gets done. And it didn't, therefore it's your fault.
Well, I have ultimate responsibility for anything that goes wrong. We've already established that, and I accept that. I accept as the principal, as the chief academic officer, as the chief the CEO, and as the chief accounting officer. I accept that that role has ultimate responsibility. But you will understand also that in a complex organisation like a university, the elements associated with dealing with these are delegated. And that was delegated to my finance director, who I assumed wrongly would do that. Well, no, but that's the nature of delegation in a complex organisation.
Not in this
like
case. In fact, it works the other way. For something as serious as this, the delegation is disregarded because it puts you as the accountable officer to make sure it happens. It works in reverse. It goes to the very top to avoid the other people, to avoid any concern that duplication leads to something being missed. And you didn't do it. And what I can't understand is that someone who has worked in the civil service of the UK government, who has worked in universities, who holds the most senior position in his own university and is representative at the time of all universities in Scotland, could get this so badly wrong. And you can't explain to this committee why you failed so badly there.
Well, I have explained. You
blamed other people.
No, I have explained that this is something that was delegated. Now, you've said to me now that it was inappropriate to have such delegation, and my role was to do the opposite of delegate, take responsibility, and ensure that was reported myself. And I failed to do that. And I don't say that I'm not explaining it. I am explaining it to you. I accept both the error and I accept the responsibility. The ultimate responsibility is the principal of the university. So I'm not ducking it or blaming it. I'm explaining to you the nature of delegation that I had expected to work in the institution that I was leader of. And the way you present it to me now, then that was a mistake.
From this side of the table, you are ducking it and you are blaming other people, but we've got a lot to get through. So I'll go to Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Professor Gillespie, for coming along today. It is appreciated. It's important that we understand what has happened here. Like the panel yesterday, you did apologise and you told us it was heartfelt, but I'm still not sure it cuts it for the staff and students who are will be watching, and so it's definitely better you did that than not, for sure. But you know, folk are still hugely concerned about their jobs, about their their studies. There's a real concern about how the university manages to move on. So that's why it's really important that we get as many answers from this today. Convener asked about the covenant, but obviously that was a very specific thing. Putting that aside, and the irregularities between the evidence that we've had around that, when were you actually aware how bad the financial situation was at Dundee University? When did it first become a red flag? There's something not right here. Never mind the technicalities of it.
So, can I just repeat my apology? And it is heartfelt. And you know yourself the extent to which all of us in Dundee relied on our university to help drive the future of the city, and how engaged the university was and remains in the future of Dundee. And to all of my ex-colleagues and students, again, I say, you have my deepest apologies for the failures in the management and governance of our university. And I feel that very, very deeply indeed. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it is important to say that as sincerely as I possibly, I don't know about the cameras, as sincerely as I possibly can to all that are watching this and watch it in the past. On the finance side, there were levels of challenge. And if I may, if I can just spend a little bit of time, if you'll permit me, Convener, to go through some of these levels. So, as I say, the university had long-term financial challenges for quite some time. And as the university came out of COVID times, and international student numbers were booming, and we took a very profitable exit, and I'm sure we'll come back and cover this as well, from a life sciences company that spun out from the university. The university had a stronger financial situation than it had in the past. Not a strong one, but a stronger one. We believed, myself, the executive group, the court, and all of its committees, and the court and its finance committee were under different leadership at the time. We believed that there was the opportunity to invest in growing the university. Real financial challenges started to come as we entered, as we were in academic year 23-24, and we saw international student numbers really start to decline very, very, very rapidly. And that was a challenge across all UK universities, all Scottish universities. And for us, that decline happened perhaps more precipitately than for some others, partly because of the markets that the University of Dundee had depended on, particularly the Nigerian market and the South Asian, so particularly the Indian, Sri Lankan market. We followed that decline of international student income, both in the University of Dundee and across Scottish universities, closely. Dundee created a series of scenarios for downside from the international student income. SFC were collecting data on that, and we're advising that we do it. And as we went into the end of academic year 23-24, it was very obvious that our numbers had declined much more significantly than even our downside scenario. And that took us into a situation where we were looking at having to deliver very significant savings in academic year 24-25. Again, other Scottish universities were in a similar situation. All of that led us to planning a deficit budget for 24-25 and 25-26, and this is all detailed in the Gillies report, as I know you'll appreciate. And then there were a number of shocks that hit us as we moved into the beginning of academic year 24-25. One was RAC. It's a reinforced autoclave concrete, where Dundee was hit harder on RAC than some of our other institutions. A second one, which wasn't huge in the grand scheme of things, but still was a shock, was the shift in NI contributions. A third one was we had missed our Scottish domestic student intake, which is very disappointing. And then thirdly, our international student numbers came down. And as we went through October into November, the size of the hole became increasingly obvious. And I briefed the Chair of Court on this, and we briefed Finance Committee on this, and we looked at coming up with a plan to turn that around. The zenith of this was at the court meeting in, and forgive me, convener, again, I don't recall the dates, November, I think, sometime in November, which was immediately after a new interim finance director had started, and as that interim finance director came on board, my first conversation with her was, I don't think things are as healthy as we've been led to believe. She said I was about to say the same thing to you, and over the course of that weekend, she found some very significant structural holes that I had hitherto been unaware of. Now, whether that's, should I have been aware of it? Absolutely. But I had not been aware of it. And at that point, I briefed the Chair of Court and Chair of Audit and Risk Committee, Chair of Finance Committee was unwell, and then subsequently, within that same day, briefed the court. Sorry, we're going to detail, but that's kind of a broad narrative.
So that's really helpful. I think folk watching will just find that incredible that yourself, surrounded by a team of people all paid significantly more than the First Minister of Scotland, yourself, multiples, I think, weren't aware of these structural problems until somebody came in the door and all of a sudden everything's clear. That's incredible. I want to go back, though, because I think the international students part of this is significant, because it feels like that is the thing, apart from the mismanagement across the board, that appears to be different in Dundee from, there's pressures across the higher education sector in the UK. But something different happened. Why was it that Dundee University were so invested in these very risky markets? And why were the signals in 23-24 not taken more seriously so that action could be taken at that point? What was the advice that you were getting? Who was responsible for taking those decisions? And just to throw things so you could be more complete in your answer, why was there a continuation in increasing the staff number in that area when it looked like numbers were coming down, but nonetheless we're still recruiting folk in terms of the team?
So, if I, as briefly as I can,
Professor Gillespie, I did allow you to give a very long answer to Mr Fitzpatrick.
Yeah.
We do need to be a bit more concise, both in questions and I don't want to stop you saying anything, but if we can get to the point, we've got a lot to get through. Thank you.
Forgive me, convener, but I hope that some of the contextualisation now will avoid having to do that contextualisation later. So if you'll permit me a little bit to say something about international student group, if I may. Dundee was very reliant on Nigerian students, on Indian students, and Chinese students. And Nigerian and Indian students were by far the largest numbers. Our Chinese student numbers were low compared to the overall international student numbers if you compare us to other research-intensive universities. And most of the students were coming to the School of Business, where there was a real effort to boost School of Business, and to engineering and to computing. The very, very big drop was initially because of the removal of dependence visas for students, and that really impacted on Nigerian numbers, as did the devaluation of the Nigerian currency. The African model, very briefly, is that students would borrow money from their families, come with their families, the spouse would work, and that would help pay for the student groceries. So that had a very big impact on a number of Scottish universities. RGU had a lot of Nigerian students, we had a lot of Nigerian students, a number of other universities did. And that mainly impacted in the School of Business. So a lot of these betterment numbers in the accounts in 23-24 were about reducing appointments into the School of Business. And that did happen eventually. The Indian students were coming into science and engineering. We were trying to boost science and engineering anyway. There was a new dean in place. And Chinese students, we had underperformed there, and they were, Chinese students were an opportunity as opposed to a particular drop-off and a cost. And forgive me, Mr. Fitzpatrick, I feel I wandered away from your question. I didn't intentionally do so, so please do come back at me.
So I'm trying to understand why action wasn't taken back in 2023-24. Everybody, all the signs were there that these markets that Dundee were involved in, and I don't think I've heard why Dundee was so invested in these riskier markets compared to other places. What was the decision making behind that, and why was action not taken? We've heard, or we've read in the submission from Wendy Alexander that she warned you that this was a problem and you ignored her. So, I mean, I guess it's probably an opportunity for you to respond to her comments as well.
Well, given that you've invited me to respond on Wendy's comment, then obviously let me begin with that. Wendy was very, very focused on pushing numbers of students up, and we had over-recruited from high-volume, low-cost markets, and that over-recruitment in 23 was causing us some quite significant academic integrity problems. So, problem number one is we were seeing students coming into the university that didn't have, at that point, the standards of academic integrity that we would expect within a Scottish university. And that caused some academic delivery challenges that I suspect Blair Grubb, when he gave evidence to this committee a few months ago, will have mentioned. More problematically, the over-recruitment, we found quite a number of students were coming in not then able to pay their fees. And so they were looking for the university to support them through hardship, but also the Dundee City Council to support them through housing and education. And as the cost of living crisis struck, we had a double whammy of an over-recruitment of students that couldn't afford to support themselves, but also an over-recruitment of students that weren't meeting the academic integrity challenges being faced. So we took a view, and this was something which was discussed at length and very robustly in the executive group, to reduce the number of students recruited from these markets, and to put caps on a number of courses where we felt that the quality of delivery was being challenged by a number of students coming in. So quite the contrary to what Wendy has said in our evidence, did we ignore advice. What we did was we took measures to reduce numbers. and we formed a new student number planning group that would take a view of not just the idea of piling numbers very high, but ensuring that we had the capacity to support students both in academic delivery and in ensuring their welfare coming in. So actually what we did was we pushed our target numbers down. At the same time, as we were looking at what would the recovery likely be from the hits of introduction of dependent visas, plus the discussions around the Migration Advisory Committee, when there was uncertainty over what Migration Advisory Committee would advise the UK government of the time relating to post-study work visas. And these pushed our numbers down, and our downside scenarios were increased so that we expected to have fewer students. And we took advice in doing this. When I say we, I mean the executive group, reporting to court. We did this with all members of the executive group fully involved, with all of the planners involved, and with clear goals on what the downside scenarios would look like. So it is simply not true to say that advice was given and ignored. Absolutely, we reduced our numbers and started to reduce our costs associated with that.
Fitzpatrick, I think we've got enough context now in your very full answers, so if we can just get to the point for the rest of them, please. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
So I guess there was a few other things that Wendy Alexander said in her report here. Was there anything else in there that you would want to respond to? Because right now, I think the balance of what we're hearing, and it's unfortunate that Wendy isn't able to give evidence to committee because of a commitment, her side is feeling much, much stronger, to be honest. So if there's anything that you feel you need to respond to in what she said, then I think you should do it, because to be fair, I'm not sure the committee is convinced by what we're hearing just now.
So first of all, we introduced I'll try and do this as succinctly as I can, Kavir. We introduced a globalisation strategy. That globalisation strategy looked at making globalisation of the university, both inwards and outwards, everyone's business. As part of that globalisation strategy, recruitment was key, as was partnership in other areas in research and enterprise when they were available. Wendy's evidence suggests that she didn't agree with that. First time I've seen Wendy say she didn't agree with it is in this evidence. So when Wendy was the architect of, and I was grateful to her for this, of the Africa strategy, which was a strategy to work with African universities around capacity building, around student recruitment, and around research opportunities. She was the architect of the Dundee PhD fellowships, and I was very grateful for that. So the notion from Wendy that she did not agree with the globalisation strategy going forward is a false representation, because she was at the cutting edge of delivering that. That's point one. You wanted to come back, Mr. Fitzpatrick, so I'll stop.
Not that's. I mean, if there's anything else around that, and there's one final area I'm wanting to come to, but if that's the kind of response there, that would be good for you to finish. If I may. In terms of, yeah.
So the issue of her being sidelined, again, is simply a misrepresentation. Wendy spent more and more time, and we gave her a lot of support to do this, in her... she talked about thought leadership on a number of committees, including Chris Skidmore's International Higher Education Commission. We supported her in doing that work, but it did mean that she was away a great deal from the university, including a great deal away from executive group meetings. They produced a report on transnational education and creating opportunities for international partnership offshore. We all thought it was an excellent report. I commended it very much. Wendy was a co-author, and we gave her a budget to try and implement that in Dundee, and I'm afraid it didn't much transpire. And what I was pushing Wendy and her colleagues to do was to spend more time in market working with agents in Nigeria, in India and beyond on building up her, the pipeline of students coming in. And let me say on an issue that I found particularly difficult to hear from her about the notion that the University of Dundee somehow tried to pay her off. What the University of Dundee tried to do was create an opportunity for Wendy to help develop the North American market, because the American market was, by which I mean Canada and the US, particularly with yeah, sorry, not Mexico. And Trump had just been elected. There was more and more interest in North American students coming to Europe. Dundee had hardly performed in North America. It was an area that Wendy knew very well. And in terms of Wendy's performance as a VP International, she performed very well at the point when Dundee had almost no international students. But as matters moved forward, Wendy's interests started to move elsewhere, around thought leadership, with the boards that she sat on. And what we needed was a VP International that spent time actually out there in the market generating student numbers to come. And so Wendy's representation of conversations around her departure, she had had a retention conversation 2 years ago. The retention conversation, as she was applying for a job elsewhere, was that she got a salary increase, and she was paid very well, and that she develop succession planning with an assistant VP International, which was done, that she look at delivering on the university strategy, and I've just commented on some of the challenges around what she's saying on strategy now. And one of her particular, we all have weaknesses, and I'm very open about mine with you, Convener, but one of her weaknesses was that she got very, very detailed in a micromanagement of professional service staff, and this was causing significant amounts of tension. So one of the elements was that she spent less time doing that and more time doing strategy, and that wasn't happening. Okay. Forgive me.
I mean, I find it somewhat ironic that someone who was on 11 foreign trips in 2 years should criticise other people for not being at the university, but I don't quite understand from your answers to Joe Fitzpatrick why then you asked your Company Secretary and Chief Operating Officer to negotiate without prejudice for a package for Wendy Alexander to leave.
So, Convener, this is a public session, and I don't want to get into a slanging match about people's characters. But Wendy's performance in terms of delivering student numbers wasn't what we needed it to be.
So why did you want to send her to North America to tap into that market then?
Because she knows North America well. She spent some time working in Canada. She had good contacts in North America. And what we were looking to do was find what we talked about as a glide path for Wendy to, she'd constantly been talking about moving on, this being her last 2 years. So we're looking for a glide path to help her do that, and at the same time create some opportunities for the university. And that was why North America was an idea. Now, she didn't like the idea, I understand that, but it was an idea. It was something put on the table, and might this work for you, Wendy?
Okay, I think others will delve into this. I'll move now to Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Gillespie. I find this particular line of questioning quite difficult to hear and to kind of add up with what we've got in front of us in terms of the evidence. So what I've seen is communication by Wendy Alexander to the university, you'll have seen this as well, highlighting at various points concerns in international students' numbers, concerns in the finance, questions about why specific management accounts weren't provided, really pressing quite difficult questions at times, including words like numbers were being massaged down, I think was one of them. It sounds to me like it was convenient for you to ask her to go quite far away so that there was nobody presenting any challenge to yourself at the time.
Well, that's certainly not the case.
Okay.
When Wendy brought analyses and challenges forward, we explored these in the executive group, and they were never ignored. It is not the case that they were ignored. They were explored, they were discussed, and they were acted upon.
So and the evidence she's given us is untrue. Is that what you're suggesting? Because she shared emails.
Well, I've not sat and looked through the emails and email responses that Wendy sent.
Okay.
What I am saying,
Professor Gillespie, the evidence was submitted to allow us to question witnesses, including yourself. And are you saying you did not prepare for this session by looking at the evidence submitted by others?
Of course I prepared for that. Sorry, I understood that Ms Duncan Glancy was talking about other material rather than the evidence. Forgive me, I misunderstood.
No, that's okay. I understand. And I also understand this is a very difficult circumstance. And so if there is any misunderstanding, please just ask for clarity and I'll do the same. She's not the only person who suggested that information wasn't flowing in ways it should. So, for example, the membership of the court and attendance at court changed, and vice principals were asked not to attend. Did you make that decision?
No.
Who made that decision?
Chair of court.
So the chair of court said yesterday she didn't.
I'm sorry, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. The chair of court made the decision that vice principals would not attend. I suggested that if they weren't at the table, they could at least be in attendance to hear the discussion. She didn't want that to take place. I'd say the VPs, there was a mixture of response. Some went, that's good, you don't want to go anyway. Others said, that's ridiculous, we need to be there. But the chair of court made a very, very, very clear decision and instructed me that VPs would not attend unless there was a specific thing when I could invite them to attend, provided the chair of court agreed. So, and if the chair of court said she didn't do that, I'm afraid that's an untruth.
So when items, for example, on the globalisation strategy were discussed, and the chair of court's suggestion was that the determination of which VPs would be invited was yours after the decision had been taken that they wouldn't ordinarily attend. Why did you... The
suggestion, sorry, rather than decision. It was her decision. Yeah.
Her decision, yeah. So she made the decision that VPs wouldn't attend.
She did.
And then relied on you inviting the relevant people.
Suggesting that the relevant people be there.
And did you ever suggest that any vice principal should be there and were told that they shouldn't?
I don't recall being told that, no.
And so when the globalisation strategy was the change in approach, why was Wendy Alexander not invited back to court after September 23 then? Given all of what you've put on the record about international student numbers and the globalisation strategy being some of the serious concern about what happened in the university, why would you not want that information?
Well, Wendy would have been invited had there been a specific agenda item in her portfolio, in the same way that the others were invited when there was a specific agenda item in their portfolio. And that was the agreement from the chair of court.
But you have also said that a large part of what happened in Dundee was down to international students and the changes in that market, and then your suggested change in approach, which was the globalisation strategy as opposed to a kind of more recruitment-based.
The globalisation strategy was a bit earlier in the year, I think.
And did you continue to share relevant data and numbers of international students with the Vice Principal?
Well, the Vice Principal was the lead in sharing the numbers. So the Vice Principal chaired the Internationalisation Committee. The Vice Principal chaired most of the operational committees. The Vice Principal was heavily involved in all student planning numbers and all the data. Not me.
But you didn't think to invite her to court at any point? You didn't think that having some of that expertise within the decisions that the university was making in order to address some of the concerns it was in didn't feel like a thing that should be...
Well, the message from the Chair of Court was that VPs should only be invited if there was a substantive agenda item which was in their portfolios and they led on. And that was something that the Chair of Court pushed very hard on and did not want large numbers of VPs around. And it applied to all, on research, on education and on internationalisation. It wasn't my choice to do this. I pushed back against this, but no, the Chair of Court insisted, and that was the way that things were done. So I reiterate, if there was a suggestion in the evidence session yesterday that that decision was not taken by the Chair of Court, I'm sorry, that's not true.
Okay, so moving on then to the decisions that were taken once the information started to become apparent. And I think there's been some disagreement about who had what information when, including from the panel yesterday, and some of which you've already said yourself today that some information wasn't available to you or you weren't aware of it at the time. But once you did become aware of it, my understanding is that the executive group advocated voluntary severance initially, and that was rejected and resisted. Can you explain? Do you recall that? And what's your reason for resisting it at the time?
So can I just play back to you what I've heard and see if I've understood the question, if I may? It's the question that the executive group suggested voluntary severance and I opposed it.
Resisted. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly not true.
Okay.
We clearly needed to reduce our cost base, and clearly that required us to look for staff cost savings. And staff cost savings needed to be achieved by a freeze on recruitment, much tighter grip on recruitment, and by, at least in the first instance, voluntary severance. And the debate was around, and you know, this would have been an absolute last resort. Would voluntary severance be sufficient to get us to the cost saving that we required, or might there be areas of the university that we needed to look at and ask whether they should continue or not? And so my push on voluntary severance was very much the what plan can we come up with on voluntary severance that will incentivise, provide a sufficient incentive for staff to look at and see it as an attractive proposition, but be within the boundaries of affordability, which were becoming much tighter. At no point did I resist voluntary severance. Quite the opposite. I was pushing for a voluntary severance plan to come forward more quickly.
Okay, thank you. And just my final question, Convener, if that's okay. Did you take in-year spending decisions without the UAG?
Did I take in-year spending decisions without the UAG? I can't think of any, but it may have been, you know, small things which is, well, let's not do that. But I don't recall that. I mean, certainly there's a level of delegation where decisions can be taken or not taken. But I cannot, and forgive me, my recollection is not 100%. I cannot think of an instance where that was done. But if you were to say to me, what about X, then of course I'll respond.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
Did you watch the session, the evidence session of Shane O'Neill and Blair Grubb and the interim chair? You watched it? Because you inferred earlier on that you hadn't, but you had watched it.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was yesterday's session. I didn't watch it.
No, the one where Shane O'Neill,
the one with
Blair
Shane
Grubb,
and Blair and Tricia, yeah.
Did you watch that?
I did.
Okay. Because you're not coming across. You say your apology is heartfelt. I have to say I don't feel it. And I really regret that, because I'm grateful that you've come today to be open and transparent. But let me give you some evidence for that, because you hadn't watched yesterday. You're not prepared to pay the £150,000 payback, the payoff back to the university. It just doesn't feel like you really feel the pain that other people are going through at this time. Do you understand how angry people are about that and why they feel that you're just not showing it?
I definitely understand how painful this is. I definitely understand that people are angry. And I'm trying to show that I do understand that. People don't want to hear that I feel pain. I do, but people don't want to hear
just
that.
pay the £150,000 back. That would be a start, wouldn't it? I mean, to hold on to that just seems astonishing with the pain that other people are feeling. And it is, you know, I know it's not, I mean, £35 million deficit scale. It's not that, but it's at least an indication that you understand. I won't press anymore. I just genuinely want you to think about that, because I think it would send an important message. It wouldn't repair the damage, but it would send an important message. So a year ago, in this very building, you remember that you gave evidence to this committee. You told me at the time, I am delighted to say that our universities in Scotland are actually quite well run. You went on to say, I do not at this moment see any risk to survival. And then you said, we are well-run institutions. Time will be my witness in this, but I personally see no risk to the viability of universities going forward. Now, at the same time, you knew that the cash reserves at the university were in steep decline, that the university had a potential breach of the banking covenant, although you've said this morning you weren't aware of that the Higher Education Times university rankings had Dundee dropping out the top 250, and also that there was an £8 million hole in that year's budget with no plans in place to deliver savings necessary to move into a surplus position. So a year ago, were you delusional or incompetent, or was there something else? Because I can't understand why you could have said all of those things to me, knowing all of those things.
So a year ago, what I said to this committee was, and you can decide whether this was incompetence or what level of incompetence this was, I believed...
Or delusional, I said. Or delusional. I mean, or something else. I just don't understand.
I believe what I said. What I was not aware of, and I've explained, and I'll do it again if the convener wishes me to, I was not aware of the covenant breaches. And the Gillies report is quite correct. The University of Dundee, me included, did not have sufficient grip on our cash reserves. And my belief at that time was that we had a rolling credit facility. We had the ability to dip into that in difficult times with international student recruitment, as other universities have had to do as well. I foresaw that we would have to downsize our university. Sorry, that's a terrible word. Take cost savings from the university, but I believed that would be managed over the course of the coming period. And what particularly hit us hard was the breach of the banking covenants and the loss of faith with our bankers, which came as a complete and utter surprise to me. And that, had I been aware of any of that at the point when I was giving evidence to the committee, first of all, I'd have given that huge amounts of attention, and secondly, perhaps I'd have revised what I said to the committee at the time.
Because there was a lot, I mean, yesterday was, to be honest, quite sad, because I think the people that were before us clearly struggled with their jobs. And the number of times they said, I wasn't aware of that information at the time, but no inquiring mind. And, I mean, Jim McGeorge, Peter Fotheringham in particular, was clearly struggling in his role. And he admitted that yesterday. If you had watched the evidence, you would have seen that. And the chair, she didn't have a financial background, she wasn't inquiring. Were you not aware of the fact that your team wasn't up to the job? It's your job to make sure you had the proper team around you. Were you not aware of any of that? Because you are passing the back on to everybody else, that you weren't told, you weren't aware, you hadn't a grip. But it's because other people hadn't told you. This is your job.
Well, I'm taking responsibility, and I've been clear on that, and I'll continue to be clear on that. The buck stops with me, and I'm not trying to avoid that responsibility. I've accepted it. I accept it. As far as the individuals you met yesterday are concerned, everything that I was hearing about Peter Fotheringham's performance was that he was quiet but effective and competent and in control. And that was the message that I got from his staff in Finance Directorate, and that was the message that I was hearing from the Finance and Policy Committee. And so, should I have dug yet further in with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of this Gillies report? The answer is yes.
It wasn't the benefit of hindsight. There were fires going on, there were warnings going on across the system of higher education, not just in Scotland but the UK. There was alarm bells. Surely the two didn't match up. All of that going on outside, but you thought you were unique, that there was no greater impact than you had already identified? I mean, surely you were asking questions around that, but no, clearly not.
We didn't think we were unique. We knew that we had very significant declines in income through international student numbers. We knew we had to plan for a deficit budget. We knew we had to do some very, very significant changes to the structure of the university, as Aberdeen did, as RGU did, as a number of universities around Scotland and the UK have done. What we did not know, what I did not know, was that we were about to breach our banking covenants, and so a rolling credit facility would be withdrawn, or that the gap in capital was as big as it did. We simply didn't have a sufficient eye on our cash reserves.
Do you think people were afraid to challenge you?
I suspect that some people were not afraid to challenge me, and some people are always be afraid to challenge. So, if you're asking me, if I can look for a subtext in this, if you're asking me, was Peter Fotheringham afraid to challenge me? I had repeated conversations with Peter on, is there something happening here that I don't know? Are you really sure that we're in a strong position? I had that with him. I had it with his with his colleagues. Jim McGeorge, I certainly don't think Jim McGeorge was afraid to challenge me. I certainly don't think Shane O'Neill was afraid to challenge me, and the members of court certainly weren't afraid to challenge me.
So, I mean, how many complaints have you had about your conduct over your career?
Well, certainly I've had no complaint about my conduct in an awful long time.
Okay. When you were at NERC, did you have any complaints about your conduct there?
At NERC?
When you were at Leicester University?
I don't recall.
Okay. Did you ask anybody to sign a non-disclosure agreement, or did the system ask anybody and to leave their post?
At NERC or Leicester?
Yeah.
regarding me. I don't remember any such instance.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. John Mason.
Thanks very much. Mr Gillespie, would you say you were somebody who deals with detail, or are you more on the big picture?
I think if that's a binary choice, more big picture.
Yes, because I have to say, with the Finance Committee, we visited last summer. I met you then. It was a great visit, and we saw the big picture. We didn't discuss the finances, but it was all very positive at that time. We were told yesterday by the Finance Director that when he prepared, or they prepared, the management accounts month by month, you didn't particularly look at them before the Finance Committee or the Audit Committee or the Court got to see them. Is that the case?
No, they went to the executive group.
Yes, but you didn't see them first, or you didn't discuss them first with him?
No, we're often very, very late papers, pushing to get them to the executive group.
Yes.
So they were often presented to the executive group at the last minute. But no, I didn't have a previous conversation with the Finance Director prior to that.
Which surprises me a little bit, because I've worked, admittedly, for smaller organisations, but as the finance manager or whatever, and the chief executive was all over me that as soon as I prepared the management accounts, before anyone else saw them, he wanted to see them, or she wanted to see them, sit down with me, went through them line by line, why was this, why was that, before they went wider. And sometimes I could give an explanation, sometimes if there was an error I had to correct them. But you didn't take that kind of hands-on approach with the management accounts, did you?
I depended on the executive group to have that conversation.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I'm following on, I suppose, from some of what colleagues have asked, but, you know, Professor Gillies, in one of her points, she says, UAG Court and their committees and groups should have been aware of the worsening financial situation as early as December 23. Now, I think you've indicated that there were certainly problems at that point. But in answer to Mr Fitzpatrick, you said that there would need to be savings in 24-25. But if the problems became obvious as early as December 23, why were cuts not made to expenditure in 23-24?
Well, there were reductions in envisaged recruitment, so there was a push down on recruitment of staff to teach students that weren't coming. But that was about avoiding an additional cost rather than pushing to a cut, and that did happen.
Yeah, but I mean, look, given the urgency of the situation, and I accept we've all got hindsight now, you know, and other universities seem to have been a bit quicker at actually making people redundant, and have been criticised for that, I accept. But it appears, and I mean, you've made the point that all universities have been facing some of these challenges, and I accept that. But Dundee seems to have been very slow compared to others in making redundancies.
Yes, we were slow compared to others in making redundancies, and with the benefit of hindsight, we should have moved forward more quickly, but we did not.
Okay. On the cash position, I think you've also accepted that kind of drifted a bit and the cash balance went down quite dramatically. We saw a lot of new buildings when we were visiting last summer. Was it too ambitious to go ahead with some of these capital expenditure? Would it have been better to not build some of these buildings?
Well, evidentially, we spent more cash than we could afford to spend. We spent more cash than I had expected us to spend, because there was an XCNC pot that was supposed to be ring-fenced, and it wasn't. So evidentially, we were spending more cash than I thought we were spending. We had a capital strategy group that was looking after that. So with the benefit of hindsight, given that we spent more cash than we had planned, some of that was over-ambitious. Some of it was required. So, for example, some of the maintenance and dealing with RAC, they had to be done. We could have put the Fulton building and mothballed it and not expended cash on that had we known the cash situation. But we did not have sufficient grip on the cash situation. And so the short answer to your question is, yes, it was too ambitious. If I come back to the Biosciences Innovation Hub, that was something which was mainly paid for out of Tay City's deal money and other money raised externally.
Okay. And you know, can you give us a picture of when these decisions were made, or decision on capital expenditure or on the staffing position? You know, was there a lot of challenge going on? Was there a big debate? Or, you know, did the finance director come to you and say, we have to make more cuts more urgently? Or did the chair of court say, you know, we need to become more urgent about this? Or was it broadly there was kind of agreement and we drifted along?
More the latter than the former. There wasn't a push. There was very little pushback from the chair of court or the chair of the finance committee. Quite the reverse. We were having somewhat light touch conversations there, which I felt were problematic. I raised it a number of times, saying, shouldn't we be having more in-depth discussion about these issues? I raised that with the chair of court, and I raised that with my executive group.
Do you think all of them had been slightly over-promoted?
All of?
Well, the three we had yesterday in particular, the chief operating officer, the chair of court, and the finance director, were they all just a little bit beyond their ability?
Well, I think, again, with the benefit of hindsight, evidentially, from what you said around this table this morning, evidentially, they were struggling. I think that the chair of court had come without much financial experience and without much large organisation experience, and the chair of court had a particular view on what she wanted to achieve as chair of court. The chair of finance committee was relatively early in her career and wasn't as able to commit as much time to a role as her predecessor. The finance director, I think, very, very evidentially, he was beyond his capability, and that is my deepest regret. The chief operating officer, I suspect he was cowed by this committee. I think he's a very competent individual.
Yeah, because the impression I'm getting is that everybody realised there was a bit of a problem, but no one, and I accept it doesn't have to be you, but nobody in the system, and from an accounting background, you know, I might have expected it to be the finance director, really, really drove this and kind of underlined the urgency and spoke to the court, spoke to the committees. That just wasn't happening, was it?
Clearly not sufficiently.
No. The auditors gave you a completely clean bill of health for the July 23 accounts, both external and I think, from what we can gather, the internal auditors were not flagging up any major issues. Now, these are both huge, two of the four largest accountancy firms in the world. So we do expect, and I think you're paying them quite a lot of money, so we expect quite a lot of competence. I mean, would your feeling now be that maybe the auditors should have been flagging things up a bit earlier?
Well, my feeling now is both the finance committee and the auditors might have been flagging things up a little bit earlier. I'm assuming, as far as the auditors are concerned, and the audit and risk committee is concerned, I'm assuming that they were taking a view on the basis of information put before them, which is the same information I had put before me. But, for example, £8 million betterment, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps that could have been flagged as something that the management group should pay more attention to.
Did the auditors, either internal or external, have direct discussions with yourself?
No, they did not.
They didn't?
No.
So when they formed a view that the university was a going concern through to July 25, that was from other people they were forming that view?
From the chair of the audit committee and finance director and others, yes, not from me.
You used the word betterment. Can you tell us, it's not a word I was familiar with, and I accept I'm not up to speed in all the latest accounting terms, but can you tell us what you understood by that word betterment?
So I admit, until I joined Dundee, it's not a term I'd come across either. My understanding of the betterment number was these were cost savings to be delivered through which had not yet been ascribed to an individual business unit. So there were cost savings which needed to. I'm going to repeat myself. Forgive me, I've said I messed up. Okay.
So in one sense, you could say there were a delaying mechanism, is that right? Because there were savings that had to be made, but they had not been decided where these savings actually specifically would be made.
My understanding was it was to recognise that the savings needed to be made and processes were in place to deliver them. So rather than a delaying mechanism, it was a flagging mechanism to ensure that these savings were delivered. So I put it as my understanding of it, it was a positive to ensure it was delivered as opposed to a delaying mechanism.
Okay. And probably about finally, covenants have been mentioned quite a lot, and Professor Gillies makes quite a big emphasis on them. I mean, I wonder how you see covenants, because I think a lot of businesses and organisations, they sign up to a loan agreement with the bank and they don't read all the small print, and that's where the covenants are. It's like most of us buy an insurance policy, we don't read the small print, but lo and behold, it can sometimes come back and bite you. Do you think that's kind of the way you and others were looking at the covenants?
I certainly did not. I did not pay sufficient attention to our covenant commitments. If I had, it wouldn't have been September, October, when I had a conversation with my finance director saying, "Tell me about our covenants, please." Yeah. And I think part of the reason for that was insufficiency of a recognition that covenants applied to drawing down a revolving credit facility rather than private placement loans. We had talked about the possibility, this is way before international student numbers came down, would the University of Dundee look for private placements? And that I understood much better the impact of covenants, but I had to ask the finance director to explain to me where we were in covenants on the revolving credit facility. And that was a failure of mine to recognise the importance of covenants, which I tried to ameliorate by the conversation I had with them. So it's a slightly long-winded answer to say, yes, we had paid insufficient attention to covenants because they hadn't seemed sufficiently live.
Yeah, I mean, just by way of comment, maybe, I mean, my experience of covenants is it's very varied. Sometimes the banks insist on them, sometimes they don't. They're more relaxed about them, but they can catch you out. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. I very deliberately moved to John Mason, despite wanting to follow up from Willie Rennie's points, because sometimes when you're asked immediately, it doesn't trigger in your memory, but you go on and discuss another subject and then come back to it. So at any point in your recollection, in your time at NERC, were there issues with staff working under you, complaints made against you about your behaviour and how they were resolved?
So in my time at NERC, there was one member of staff who did make a complaint against me, and that was about overbearing behaviour. I'm not going to mention the individual's name in public. And in terms of how it was resolved, at some point that individual moved on to another job across the research councils, but I wasn't involved in that process, so I can't say in answer to Mr. Ronnie's question, was there an NDA or a movement? I simply don't recall that. I wasn't involved in that.
Mr. Rennie's first question was, were there any complaints about your behaviour? You now seem to know an awful lot about this case.
Have you reminded me of that? Yeah.
Did you deliberately not answer Mr Rennie earlier?
Well, I've very deliberately been really clear now.
Because you're being pressed.
Well,
but why couldn't you remember it just a few minutes ago?
Your comment, convener, is quite right.
Okay,
that sometimes, when the question's asked, it's what, and then you reflect on it as the next question comes in. So I've reflected, and I've done exactly as you suggested. I'm grateful for you coming back on that.
Because this individual, has outlined what it meant to them, and they actually say, a decade on, they can't talk about some of the ways you treated them and others because it's too upsetting. A decade on, you're still having an impact.
I'm very disturbed to hear that.
I'll take Willie Rennie in just now.
2 questions. This individual also said that there was others at Leicester University that knew about your behaviour, and it was widespread, widely known. And secondly, you said that there's, in your first answer to me, you said certainly not in, I can't remember what period you said, but I am sure you implied Dundee. So other than Leicester, before Leicester, any other times of any other complaints that you were aware of or people objecting to your behaviour? Was there any of that at any time? Come on, you would remember about these things, surely, because they're a direct criticism of your behaviour. I would certainly know if people were complaining about my behaviour. Nothing else.
Well, we just discussed NERC.
Mm-hmm. So, other than that, none at all.
You're taking me back into the civil service now. Gosh, it's a long time ago. I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Okay. If you remember by the end of the meeting, can you take the opportunity to correct us? Yeah? Be grateful for that.
I'll reflect on that as we go through the meeting.
Do you understand why that, even the acceptance of one case, and this individual tells us there were others at NERC and potentially elsewhere, and you'll think about during the course of the meeting, that then does back up what you contested in the Gillies report at the very start of this evidence session about your behaviour. So it's not just Gillies saying it in this report of last week, it goes back years and decades.
Given what you've just said to me, I fully understand why you're probing this.
So do you now accept the characterisations that Gillies put in her report?
Well, I told you I didn't recognise at the very beginning the characterisations that Gillies put in her reports, and particularly the characterisations about not dealing with women well, where I created a situation where the executive group was gender balanced, where we increased the number of women directors in professional services. We took steps to increase the number of professors, women professors. Some of my closest confidants in working forward in strategy were women, director of strategy, head of the chief of staff, and others. So,
it's helpful that you mentioned these various different titles. First of all, I just want to say I hope the person that was strong enough to outline what happened to them 10 years ago takes some encouragement from the fact that under probing you've been able to recollect that, and it does match a pattern of behaviour that Gillies reported. But you mentioned a number of roles there to try and defend how you have acted as a leader. In the 4 years you were principal, the following left the University of Dundee senior leaders, senior management: 4 directors of people, 3 directors of finance, 3 directors of external relations, 3 directors of strategy, and 4 chiefs of staff in the principal's office. So at any time when these 17 people were separately leaving the University of Dundee, did you ever think the problem was not the individuals that left, but the one that remained, you?
Well, my recollection is we had 2 finance directors, 3 if we include the interim.
We do, yeah.
One moved on to a very significant...
It's 17 people in senior leadership roles in just 4 years that you were in charge of the university, gone. And at no point when these numbers start stacking up did you think you were the problem rather than them?
On these particular roles, did I think I was the problem rather than them? No, I didn't think I was the problem for them leaving. A number of individuals left because of challenging environments they found themselves in. Did I think I was a problem rather than them? No.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Camilla. Good morning, Professor Gillespie. Did you ever struggle in your role as principal?
I think any principal that says he didn't struggle in the role at some point in time would be, to use Mr. Rennie's word, delusional. So yes.
And in what areas would you say you particularly were struggling in that role?
So first of all, the beginning as principal, the imposter syndrome challenge was an issue. I had a coach. I was part of a peer group that worked with me. The area that I found a particular gap for me was around education, because I came from a research background, not from an education background. So understanding quality assurance systems, understanding education delivery, understanding student attainment, that was an area that I needed to learn. I struggled with developing strategy on how we could create a strategy that brought everyone in. I'm sure there are other areas, but they're the immediate ones.
That's interesting. And in Professor Gillies' report, she says she received many reports that the principal frequently demonstrated hubris and excessive pride in his role. And do you think that was from that training you'd received or personal traits?
I must admit that was one of Pamela's comments that I was trying to kind of understand what she meant by that. I very deliberately took a position where I wanted to try to instill confidence and direction in the university and talk the university and the ability of both the university and the city up. And if that's interpreted as hubris, then I accept that as part of it. I think the role of being a university leader. Pride in my role, well, of course I was proud of being the principal of a great university. I'm not sure what excessive pride in the role means there.
I wanted to ask a few points for clarification on yesterday's session, because, and you clearly haven't been able to watch that, but there were a number of questions surrounding your expenses. So can I start? Did you approve your own expenses?
No, my expenses went through either a chief operating officer or a chief finance officer.
So at no point did you sign off on any of your own personal expenses?
I wasn't signing. I can't sign off on my expenses.
And
I mean, the evidence yesterday was the Chief Finance Officer and the Chief Operating Officer were not involved in your expenses. Are you saying they were wrong yesterday? The Chair of the Court accepted there was a policy that she would have to sign them off, but the Finance Director at the time and the Chief Operating Officer said they were not involved in your expenses.
Well, around a year ago, I asked the question, can I just be sure, please, that the Chief Operating Officer is signing off my expenses, to which the answer I got from, whether it was him or whether it was the Chief Strategy Officer, I don't remember, was yes, this is the system at which your expenses are signed off. I said, thank you. Because that's what my understanding of how expenses were signed off was. And that was the agreement I reached with the previous Chair of Court, Ronnie Bowie.
Miles Briggs.
so the auditor's report suggests that your expenses broke claim rules. Do you recognise that?
I was unaware of that.
So the auditor has reviewed your expenses and say that 90% of purchase card claims it reviewed over £87,000 didn't comply with university policy. You didn't know anything about that then?
That's, I'm afraid, news to me now, Mr. Briggs.
So it's a...
To interrupt again. This is evidence on our committee webpage. We requested this information, we received it, it is available not only for us to prepare but for you to prepare. So you're saying you did not look at that in advance of this meeting?
Look, I read through a great deal of material for this meeting, and I apologise I missed that.
Okay. Miles Briggs.
Have you ever read the Courier newspaper?
Yes, I read the
I'm
Courier
referring
newspaper
to an
when I was
article
in
of the 23rd of this month. So I just wondered, all this is questions I would have expected if I was in your shoes to
Right.
be
No,
prepared.
I've not been reading the Courier newspaper recently.
Recently. I can understand that, to be quite frank. But I wanted to ask, the Gillies report specifically talks about extravagant spending. Do you recognise that?
I think the expenditure was always focused on needs of the business and the future of the business. There were some expenses where we were entertaining, for example, Chinese delegations, when we were trying to create an environment with them that would match the reception they gave us as we tried to push our partnership and our numbers up. Now, perhaps it came across as extravagant. Certainly it was intended to build a relationship.
Do you think at any point you'd use your position to fund your lifestyle?
Well, from my salary funds has funded my lifestyle, not anything else.
But your expenses, if I've looked through them from the auditor's report, this is all first class only travel. This is all top hotels. In fact, this is where the auditor took significant umbrage that didn't meet any of the policies outlined. You didn't care about any of that. It was just had to be the best for you wherever you were going.
I didn't book the hotels, or I set out the timings of when I needed to be where, but I wasn't sitting saying, put me in Hotel X, put me in Hotel Y. And certainly when I was travelling in China, that was the hotels, my understanding, were paid for a corporate discounted rate. So we may have been staying in good hotels, but we're staying in good hotels at a more favourable price.
Yeah. Two more questions. The first one, and it returns to what other members have asked you, in terms of what you're saying is you taking responsibility and the heartfelt apology you've given today. Do you not think it would be an act of, recognition of the role you've played and the situation Dundee University now finds it in if you did pay back that £150,000? I don't know how many members of staff that would save their jobs with, but do you not recognise that? And that could be actually a really important point for you to send a message to students, to the staff who are left at Dundee, that you understand your role in this saga.
Well, Mr Briggs, you're one of several members of the committee
Yeah.
that have suggested that, and I will reflect on it.
Thank you for that. And just finally, and again, this was from some of the evidence which Professor Gillies took. And it was in relation to Sir Peter Matheson, who was included in the New Year's Honours list 2 years ago. And it was said to her by a number of colleagues that you had said you want one of those. Is that accurate? When Sir Peter Matheson was included in the New Year's Honours, is that something you also wanted to see your name go forward for? Did you discuss that with any colleagues when you were at university? It's the evidence we've received suggests that.
Are you asking, was I kind of lobbying for someone to put me forward for...
So I'm not. The evidence
is that the question?
Yes.
Was I lobbying?
So the evidence suggests you said you want one of those. So I just wondered, do you recall ever suggesting?
I may have said in humour at some point, oh, it'd be nice to have one of those, but that's far away from, I want one of those, get me one. I think that's a very, very, very different situation.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Do you know how much your trips cost? The Hong Kong trip, for example. What was the cost of your flights, your hotel, your expenses?
I haven't looked at that number.
It was over £7,000. Was that value for money?
Well, what we were trying to... So one student is £20,000.
So what were you...
One significant...
Sorry, no, on that. So were you knocking on doors, encouraging students to come over? I mean...
No, it's exactly the same as every other university principal does, which is to travel and meet alumni and broker partnerships, including with Hong Kong University of Medicine, which is a top-rated university, meeting alumni, looking for opportunities for advancement, i.e. Donations in the long term, and creating partnerships. Now, can one put immediate monetary value in the return on that? It's very difficult to do. It's a long-term relationship business.
So over £7,000 on that trip, £4,723 of that were your business class flights, which Mr Briggs has just said broke the policy. Why did you need to go business class when another senior member from the university went premium economy?
Well, Hong Kong trip wasn't just Hong Kong. It was as a platform for elsewhere in China. So let's not...
The question is about two members from the university going, you up front business class, 4,723, your colleague behind you in premium economy. Why was premium economy good enough for them but not good enough for Professor Ian Gillespie?
So I had an agreement, like most other university principals do, with the chair of court that when I travelled long haul and had to perform and represent the university, I would travel business class. And that's what I did.
Do you think it's right that your colleague had to travel premium economy? Or do you think you could have shown that you were, someone who's saving every penny and you would also travel premium economy?
Could you remind me who the colleague was?
I'm not going to mention the names of other colleagues. You're in front of us today. I can't imagine there was that many of you on the flight that you can't remember.
I don't remember who was on the flight.
Okay, right. You took 11 trips over 2 years. I mentioned that earlier. Iraq, Malawi, what were you gaining there?
So Malawi, we had launched a commitment to Africa, and our intention was to work with universities in Africa, particularly in Malawi, in Nigeria, in Ghana, a number of other countries, to develop opportunities for research, invest in African development, and create a welcoming environment for African students to come to the University of Dundee. And our African students were incredibly appreciative of the work that the university was doing with Africa, including with Malawi, when we worked with the 6 public universities in Malawi on a partnership which we talked about as a Blantyre Declaration, which was a partnership of equity with these universities.
And did you travel business class to both Iraq and Malawi?
When I travelled long haul, I travelled business class.
So you travelled business class to all these destinations?
When I travelled long haul, I travelled business class.
Jackie Dunbar on this point.
Thank you very much, Convener. If what I'm getting is you had an agreement with the Chair of Court, did you say, Professor Gillespie, that you would travel business class?
That's correct.
Okay, so following that, I understand you had that agreement with them, but who would have been ultimately responsible for authorising the bookings and the flights for you to go to these countries? Because, well, first of all, I'll ask you, who would authorise your expenses?
Well, my office did the bookings, yes, and the logistics and the operational issues, and my understanding, as I've repeated earlier, was that either the Chief Finance Officer or the coup would sign the expenses off. Okay.
And did you not at any time question them? Because I know if a member of my team in my office booked me for first class, which wouldn't be allowed under Parliament policy, my first question would be, hold on a minute, very nice, but I've got to follow the public pound here, and that's not appropriate for me to take that way of travel. So did you not think at any point that you have got to follow, I presume, the university pound, because that's money that the university could have used for other things?
I was very conscious of whether the trips that I was going on would deliver returns to our university. And that was the case in China, that was the case in Malawi, that was the case in Iraq. Sorry, Convener, I didn't talk about Iraq earlier. And that was the case in Southeast Asia. I would discuss with my senior team the trips that I was going on and ensure that my senior team thought that they would be value for money.
Did you think they were value for money?
I'm trying to think if there's any I went on that I thought, why am I here?
That's not the question. I'm not asking about the destination, sir. I am asking about your hotel facilities, the bookings that you had. Did you think the amount that was spent from, I presume, university funds was value for money on your travel and booking arrangements? Did you feel that the university was getting value for money for those bookings?
I think the university was getting value for money for these bookings. Long haul, I went business class, and a short haul, I went Ryanair.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I'll get any more.
Okay. Before I take in Ross Greer, I want to go back to Willie Rennie.
While this committee's been meeting this morning, the individual who complained about you at NERC has communicated back to me. The individual says, "Thank you," in capital letters. "I did not move to another research council. I left completely and went to a university, completely broken. I lost a lot, including my final salary pension."
I said that I couldn't recall where that individual went. I knew that. I believe that individual went back to the research councils, but
the words are completely broken. The
yes,
words
no,
are
I've heard
final salary pension.
I've heard that.
And there's no point in going over it again. But to deny it initially, and then for this person to feel so strongly about it and to have affected their life so deeply, for you not to recall, I'm afraid that tells us a lot about you. Convener.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Gillespie, you mentioned earlier on that the decision to leave the university was taken essentially over the course of a weekend, discussions between yourself and the then chair of the court. In those discussions that led to your decision to leave, did you at any point discuss with the then Chair of Court potential candidates for the interim principal position, or who would take on your responsibilities, given that you were leaving essentially immediately without notice?
No, we didn't have that discussion.
One element of questioning yesterday, I think all members of the committee struggled with, was the lack of information that appeared to be provided to the university court. And the then Chair of Court didn't want to ascribe motivations to that. I asked you, was this simply missteps? Was this incompetence, or were there deliberate efforts to withhold information from the court? 'Cause it certainly seems that the University Court was not aware of a number of specific issues and of the growing crisis until it was essentially too late. Do you feel at any point that you withheld information from the court? And if so, what were your reasons for doing so?
Well, I certainly wasn't deliberately withholding information from court. I would have conversations with the Chair of Court on specifics. So I had a conversation with the Chair of Court as I began to see the severity of our financial situation. And the Chair of Court's view was very firmly that she communicates with court members and I communicate with her. So there was an asymmetry, looking backwards, and what I was telling everyone in court in a timely fashion, as opposed to the Chair of Court.
So, if I'm understanding what you're saying right, I think what you're trying to imply is that you were providing her with more information, but you felt that it wasn't your place to provide the whole court with that information because she'd made clear to you that was her role? Is that fair?
I think that's a fair summary of what I've just said, yeah.
So there were, I mean, you were obviously present at court, you're part of the court. Did that make you feel uncomfortable that discussions were taking place at court and you knew that you had provided, from your perspective, that you had provided the chair with more information than you believe she was then providing to the whole court?
So, if I can be clear here, there was no situation, certainly I can recall, whereby there was a court meeting and there was something that I told the Chair of Court wasn't then, that was around our finances, wasn't revealed to the court. In terms of court meetings themselves, there was a sense to me, of speak when you're spoken to. So did I find that comfortable? I found that a very contrasting style to the previous Chair of Court.
You understand why that's challenging for me to accept, particularly given the discussions that we've just had about your character, from being honest, and what's in the Gillies report about it. It appears what you're trying to present to me this morning is that you felt cowed and unable to fully contribute. You only speak when spoken to. I find that very hard to believe, particularly having sat with the previous Chair of Court yesterday and sitting with you now and having met you before and what's in the Gillies report. I find it very hard to believe that you would have felt so cowed as to be unable to fully contribute, and to only contribute when you were invited to do so by the Chair. Is that what you're trying to suggest?
Well, you've used the word cowed. I haven't used the word cowed.
That certainly seemed to be what you were implying. You said speak when spoken to. I just find it very hard to believe that you would accept that, knowing what I do about your character, what's in the report, having met you before, etc. I just find that's incredibly hard to believe.
The Chair of Court was pretty clear to me that she wanted me to say little, and I would ask to comment, and she might allow me to comment, she might not allow me to comment. And she chaired what she saw as a very tight court meeting. And I'm not saying I was cowed, but I come back to the, it's probably an exaggeration to say speak when you're spoken to, but certainly my contributions were relatively small compared to what they had been previously.
And did you feel that there were attempts made to reduce the participation of the wider executive group at court, and that perhaps resulted in a lack of effective scrutiny, that the right people weren't in the room? Because it appears one of the potential issues here is the two bottlenecks. One, based on what you're trying to present through the then chair of court, and another through yourself, and that if a wider group of executive group members had been present at court, then perhaps court members would have felt better able to direct specific questions and effective lines of scrutiny. Did you feel uncomfortable about any attempts to reduce the participation of the wider executive group at court?
Well, as I said in response to an earlier question, it's something that I said I thought was a bad idea, and we should have members of the executive there. And if the chair of court didn't want the individuals sat round the table, this table, then at least have them in the rooms so that they could contribute when necessary. And the chair of court said that that's not what she didn't. She didn't want that. So did I feel uncomfortable with that? Yes, I did.
I'll leave it there, Convener, and come back in later on, perhaps.
We've completed the original questions from committee members, but as Mr Greer has just indicated, a number of us will come in again later on in the session, but we've also been joined by two of the regional members who have taken a significant interest in this topic for quite some time. So I will move now to Michael Mara.
Thank you, Convener. As I'll put on record today, as I did yesterday, my previous employment at the University of Dundee, our time at the University I think overlapped by maybe 3 months, Dr Gillespie. When you were essentially asked to leave the university, you seemed to indicate earlier on you weren't very happy about that. Did you feel betrayed?
I was very sad and I was very shocked. Not shocked. That's not true. I was very sad. I could clearly see that the financial situation was deteriorating very quickly. And I recognised that as the principal and chief executive, I had to take responsibility for that. So when I was asked to leave, of course it hurts, and of course I was sad. Do
you remember the date when you left?
It was the beginning of December.
Okay, December 2024. So, did you, when you left, like I mean, you seem, in terms of the way that you present some of your evidence today, you're a man who has a bit of flair for language and for presentation, as many people in your position would. But when you left, on your desk at University House, there was a copy of a book called The Spy and the Traitor, upon which you'd put your keys and your staff card. Was that because you felt there was traitors, you felt betrayed?
Sorry, forgive me, it's a very inappropriate reaction. Apologies. No, not at all. That was a book that Professor Mike Ferguson had lent me, and I was just leaving it there to be...
Because the sense was, I think, from the conversation earlier on, about the final, your departure, was that you were not very happy about the whole thing. Why did the Chair of Court felt you had to leave? Was it because you had caused the situation, or because you weren't part of the solution to the situation?
So she didn't discuss with me being part of the solution. Her discussion with me was simply,
she didn't tell you why.
You have to go. We've lost faith in you, you have to go.
So that must be about, you've lost faith, because you've known, in the evidence you've given us today, and that we've seen in the Gillies report, you've known there's very significant financial problems in the institution since being generous early spring of that year, of 2024, being generous. So you've known for that period of time. What I've been told by very senior colleagues, including Professor O'Neill, was that there was just complete inaction from you between that point, when everybody knew, and then the point in December. So, as we've heard, no action on voluntary severance. You thought it should happen, but you couldn't deliver it. In your own words, we're told by other evidence you didn't think it should happen at all. So that period, also the Gills report says there were moments when the university could have changed course, but didn't. And you weren't able to deliver any of that. Why would you describe your actions over that period between spring and December and your departure? What were you doing to try and save 3,000 jobs?
So what I was trying to do was look at how we reduce our costs. And so this idea that there was inaction from me over voluntary severance, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. The executive group and Shane and others were fully involved in that conversation. We're looking at how could we reduce our costs. And
but it didn't happen, Professor Gillespie. So it didn't happen. You were the leader of an institution in existential crisis, where clearly the costs had got completely out of control, spending, as we heard in these reports, completely out of control, income that you were already seeing was collapsing, and you couldn't deliver a voluntary severance scheme. You couldn't push that through the organisation. Why not?
Well, we had, first of all, tried to identify areas where our performance was particularly poor, where we were overstaffed, and where student recruitment was poor and academic performance was poor. And I, with other colleagues, led a number of analytical discussions on that.
But Professor Gillespie, analytical discussions, at this time, headcount in the university was continuing to rise. We have that in evidence. So the number of people employed was climbing and climbing and climbing. There was £35 million of savings identified in the budget that you had signed off, and no action to actually deliver against any of them.
Well, there was some action. There was action to reduce hiring costs, particularly through School of Business. And there was a programme developed on how we could deliver a £17 million deficit budget. And that would have been through a VS scheme. You are right that the executive group cycled around together with the court on what such a voluntary severance scheme should look like.
Suppose the character,
right also to say that was burning money.
Okay, but it was burning money, absolutely clearly, and the building is alight at this point. I mean, the character, I think, with evidence we've heard today, is that you were a principal for the good times, the good time Charlie, and when it turned, you were completely inactive. You couldn't deal with it. So you liked going abroad, being a very credible face for the institution. Professor Gillies says that clearly. But the difficult decisions, the stuff that had to be done, you just weren't interested, were you?
That's absolutely not the case.
Well, there's no evidence that you've actually managed to achieve anything in that period. That's why we're sitting here now.
We had not realised the urgency of the situation regarding banking covenants, breaching our banking covenants so that we could not rely on the revolving credit facility to manage our way to reduction in costs. And we were still looking at, and Wendy Alexander was pushing this very hard on what might the international student recovery look like. And Wendy's view is that it would recover quite quickly. And
okay. On the revolving credit facility, why, in terms of the amount of money that you were spending, whether on capital or otherwise, did you deplete the university cash reserves and not use the revolving credit facility as other institutions would do?
I've already said, and I'll say it again, and I'm not proud of this, I'm trying to be as open as I can be. We had a very, very insufficient focus on our own cash reserves. And the message that we got, which I did not interrogate sufficiently well from the finance director, was that we had no needs to use either a revolving credit facility or look for additional loan placement because we had we were at a strong cash position.
So this has been stressed by accountants as an incredibly unusual move. Incredibly unusual. That at a time when you knew there was a problem in expenditure and income, you were continuing to use your cash reserves and depleting your cash reserves as a business rather than using the credit facility. Now, it turns out you probably couldn't have used the credit facility for all the issues of covenant, but at no point did you say, why are we doing this rather than taking on long-term credit to make sure we retain our cash position? That was a basic of the business. Did you not understand that?
So I looked to our finance function and finance and policy committee to give me advice on the way that we spent with our capital and the way that we invested. And I didn't get criticism or advice from them to do something different.
You just kept spending? Because the level of expenditure, this is the big difference. There's been a lot of focus in the conversation today on international recruitment, and you have a good handle on that area. Lots of other areas you don't appear to have a very good handle on. I could list some of those. But the issue is that we have the expenditure in the institution is the real problem. There's many universities, isn't there, in Scotland, circling around the pit. The reason that the University of Dundee has tipped into it is that you massively depleted the cash reserves of the institution over the previous 14 months. You liked spending the money and investing, didn't you?
There's no issue about like or not like. We had a capital, capital strategy group that took these decisions and reported to the executive group. I didn't.
You didn't take these decisions?
Well, we took the decisions as an executive.
But you were the person who was saying that you were aiming to become a £500 million turnover organisation. On what basis, what idea did you base that was possible when you knew the underlying challenges of the institution?
Well, that was at a point when international student recruitment was soaring and increasing, and we asked the question, could we deliver that? We didn't sit and put a timeline on that. It was a heuristic narrative for what we might think about for ambition of the organisation.
The hubristic narrative, I think. What we had yesterday was, and again, if you had listened to it, we had several members giving an account to the long-term strategic challenges that the institution has, the imbalance between research and teaching income, which I think you would acknowledge, and you have acknowledged in part in your evidence today, the challenges over a period of time. But instead, is it not right that you bet the future of the whole university and the city on rapid and continued growth?
We expected to see continued growth. We expected to see international student recruitment go up. And as it became obvious that that was increasingly challenging with visa changes and others, then we looked at how could we contain our expenditures.
So Universities UK issued a report at the start of 2024 saying that that wasn't going to be the case. There were two major reports published saying for warning signals about the international recruitment market. You recognise that?
And in 2024 we saw our numbers coming down, and we looked at reprofiling our ambitions.
And you said that the Gillies review says, Court was briefed orally by the Principal on the state of the financial health of the sector and routinely and confidently advised that Dundee was, in quotes, bucking the trend and doing better than most. Why did you think you were immune to an international situation?
Well, I didn't think we were immune. I was basing that on the data that I was getting from student planning, from my executive colleagues and from finance.
But you knew that the Nigerian currency had collapsed. You could have read that in the FT or in The Economist.
I knew
so why did you think those people would keep coming?
Well, because these were the planning numbers, and these were the data that I was getting from my colleagues, and I believed it.
And you didn't say at any point, I think that sounds a bit optimistic, given that the currency has lost 70% of its value in Nigeria. I think we should be looking at that again.
Repeatedly looked at are these numbers actually realistic, which was why we increased the downside scenario for student recruitment.
But on the budget, how that relates to the budget, though, in June you were told that you were modelling for a 25% reduction. Other members of the executive said we should be looking at 35%. Perhaps at least, of a reduction. But the budget left that meeting and continued on the basis of a 25% reduction, didn't it? Well, when the budget went to that meeting, that was based on the
the data that was available at that time, we talked about, well, what would happen if there was a 35% reduction? How much of a difference would that make? And I don't recall the figures now for this.
You started off this session by saying the university found itself in an invidious financial situation. You put the institution in an invidious financial situation, didn't you? Through uncontrolled expenditure, lack of ability to realise savings, lack of realistic predictions around international recruitment, and 3,000 people's jobs, the taxpayers on the hook for £122 million as a result of this, grotesque level of failure. You've said you apologise. Do you take responsibility for that level of financial vandalism? Well,
I've repeatedly said, and I'll say it again, as the principal and as the head of the institution, it is for me to take overall responsibility for the failure of the organisation. I've said that repeatedly, I'll say it again.
So you've no grip on expenses policy, no grip on the covenants, no grip on savings, no grip on expenditure, no grip on governance. I mean, that's what we've heard today, Mr Gillespie, in terms of your evidence. You know, lots of well-informed views around the international recruit market. It seems that that was the thing that you were concerned about. You were absent because the day after you resigned, you were due to fly off to China again, weren't you? For the 14th time, 14th international trip within that year. Were you not an absent landlord?
No, I wasn't an absent landlord, but I had a team that I trusted.
And were you betrayed?
Was I betrayed?
Well, that's the characterisation that you're giving in your evidence.
No, it's not a characterisation I'm giving at all. What I'm saying is there were some things that I didn't know, that I should have known, that I didn't know.
Okay.
And particularly around the covenant issue, which was a particularly problematic one.
Thank you, Kabir.
Thank you. So just on that line of question, particularly around finances, do you have any particular training in dealing with significant finances and such like, or did you rely heavily on finance director, the team around the finance director and others?
Earlier in my career, I did an MBA, which gave me some understanding. But no, I relied mainly on finance director and the finance team.
That's good to get on record that you relied mainly on them. Because overnight we were provided with information from a current member of the court who apologised for getting this to us so late, but this document had just come into their hands. And it's your handwritten amendments to the financial statements of 2023-2024. I've got them in front of me here, which makes me query why you're getting so involved while you're doing handwritten amendments to the financial statements if you've just told us seconds ago that you relied so heavily on the finance director and the team around the finance director. So just to elaborate, there's a sentence in here that says there was overall adverse impact resulting in an operational deficit. That's what was written, but in your handwritten notes you wanted that changed to say a small operational deficit. There's another element of it that says the university's 2023-24 financial performance was adverse to budget. Your handwritten note wanted that changed to say the university's financial performance was comparatively strong compared to much of the sector in what has been a turbulent year, but nonetheless adverse to the budget. You don't have training, you rely heavily on your finance team, but you want to paint a brighter picture by changing this. Now, the auditor rejected it. Your handwritten amendments didn't pass muster. Why were you trying to do that? And to go back to what Pamela Gillies said about your character, you always tried to present too bright a picture.
So, I'm assuming that was the narrative at the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah. So the narrative...
Did you write handwritten notes on much of the financial?
No.
No.
The narrative at the beginning was something that, I'd take a view on as exactly that. I believed at the time that our deficit was 1.2, 1.3 million. No, it wasn't. It was 12 point something. But that was the data that we had in front of us at Finance and Policy Committee.
No, I'm not going to... No, we're not having this. You wrote these. Hold on. No, because I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
You wrote these on the 16th of December, 16th of October 2024. It's when you put in these handwritten notes. Less than a fortnight later, the auditors had finished their work and didn't accept your amendments. So it's not that a passage of time made people realise what you were trying to insert into this document wasn't backed up. It was days.
Well, so perhaps what that's reflecting is my misunderstanding of the financial situation at the time.
So you shouldn't have been trying to interfere in that way?
Well, I wasn't trying to interfere. I was just trying to create a narrative.
A more positive narrative than the figures substantiated?
Well, it wasn't a more positive narrative than the figures that I understood substantiated.
Well, certainly that the auditors understood, because it took them days to reject what you
suggested.
said.
That's what auditors are for. Auditors are there to say, no, you got this wrong.
You're not there to do that. This had already been written, it had been printed off, and you're scribbling all over it to make it seem more positive, to make it look like you're running a university that is profitable, that is doing well, when you weren't.
Well, we've spent 2.25 hours with me repeatedly saying that I was insufficiently cited and aware of the financial situation at the time. And what I've continually been saying was I wasn't trying to present a more positive picture. I was trying to present the picture that I believed was the case. Now, I was wrong.
You were clearly trying to make these financial statements look better than they were, and you were found out days later by the auditors. I'll move to Maggie Chapman.
Thank you very much. Convener, I'll begin today, as I did yesterday as well, just by putting on the record my interest. I was elected as Rector of the University of Dundee in March, and will take up that post in August. Thank you for your comments so far. You said earlier, Ian, that you loved the university and that you wanted to be part of its future. Why then, when the urgency of the situation came to light in November, when staff and the wider university community were told about the gaping black hole, did you not spend time on campus? Did you not make yourself available for staff, for students? And instead, you sent your deputy to the first town hall meeting that was arranged, that was called by campus trade unions, to bring staff together to discuss the situation.
I'm not going to get into in public, because everyone's watching, why, because it's very private to me. But I had a deep private commitment that I needed to make that weekend, and I discussed with my coup and with my DVC whether or not they thought it was acceptable for me to honour that private commitment and for them to present. And they were supportive of my private commitment that weekend. But forgive me, Mr. Chapman, I'm not going to get into the detail of that because it is deeply private and it's a public hearing.
That's fine. I'll accept that. I just had to ask the question. Yep. In 2023, in April 2023, the STUC called the university a rogue employer. Can you give us some indication about how you, in your role as university leader, you try to foster good relations with campus trade unions, with the broader staff community, and actually with students as well?
So, when I came into the University of Dundee, it had particularly problematic relationship with employees around, for example, pension reform, but also around school merger and some job losses. And I tried to interact with all of the unions around finding a way through these challenges. We ended up with a revised pension reform process and revised school merger. And I tried to make myself, from then on, available to staff and students. I tried to communicate with them regularly, and I tried to have an on-campus presence where I would be available to stop and chat to colleagues. As far as the day-to-day connections with the unions were concerned, that was run by the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, the coup, and the Director of HR, and their advice to me was if I stay away from that, then I can be brought in when there's particularly weighty issues that needed the principal's presence to be discussed, which never happened at the time I was there.
So you say it never happened. You did get involved, though, in 2021-22 when you were trying to close the pension scheme, the UOD SS pension scheme. You said at a meeting, apparently, that keeping the scheme open would be an existential threat to the university. Do you remember that? Do you recall that? And that's clearly an example of you getting involved in industrial relations. Although you've just told us you didn't really.
Well, no, I did say that on the pension reform piece I did get involved.
Okay.
Sorry, to be clear. The pension reform piece was agreed by court prior to my arrival at Dundee, and then the very final sign-off to that was some month after I arrived in Dundee. It was something that I absolutely inherited. There was a great deal of pushback against that, which, candidly, I'm not surprised given the nature of the reform that was on the table. And I did get involved, including discussions with the union representatives on how we could reduce the future liabilities for the organisation through the pension scheme, maintain investment in the gap in the capital to pay pensioners, and change pension benefits, pension schemes for new staff joining. So in that I did get quite heavily involved.
Did you ever suggest or think to suggest that it would be useful to have more direct involvement of staff and students in decision-making at different levels of the university, given that what this committee has heard and what is very apparent spending any time on campus, the lack of trust, the concerns around transparency and openness and information flow, communication. Did you ever think that actually it might be better to have more people involved in the discussions, to share more information, to hear different ideas about different ways of navigating through what were difficult times?
So we did that with the reform of the 3 schools into 1, where there were a series, quite a long series of meetings involving staff and students on what a future, at the time it was called a new combined school, might look like. There was significant involvement of staff and students in the development of the strategy, and we introduced a staff survey. You said we did a mechanism to try and take better account of staff views, and that was done, forgive me on exact dates, 2 years into my tenure. Okay, because there's also a document that, a report that was produced following that restructuring that had some pretty robust recommendations for university management about improving communications, about improving openness, transparency and a flow of information. And it appears that over the last couple of years, none of those recommendations were implemented. Now, I've challenged UEG on this previously, but do you recognise that actually more should have been done to improve some of that, and that might have led to some of the financial questions, shall we say, being raised and possibly dealt with earlier? So in the first part of your question, should we have engaged more with staff and students? I recognise that would have been a positive thing to have done. there was involvement, but there's never enough, so there should have been more. Would that have led to better decision making on finances and other issues? I don't know.
Okay. Okay. If you had become aware of accusations or claims of misogyny and homophobia across the institution, regardless of who was making those accusations or who was being accused, what would you have done?
I would have asked for advice from the University Deputy Secretary on the extent to which there was substance to them.
You wouldn't have perhaps reflected that that might indicate something about the culture of the institution, notwithstanding any individual or specific issues, but a broader cultural issue?
I reflected deeply and often on the culture of the University of Dundee. Again, when I first joined the university, it was just after a survey had been done around racial discrimination, and it was clear that the University of Dundee had a number of ingrained racist elements, which was why we moved forward to establish the membership of the Race Equality Charter with an action plan around race. Also, we looked at how could we ensure that other protected characteristics were given appropriate focus across the university, whether it was a disability or other protected characteristics. Was I, if I can answer what I think might be an underpinning question, did I think that the University of Dundee had across it a healthy culture? I think the University of Dundee continued to have a culture of keep your head down, there's too much blame around, and there's insufficient, it's not as open an institution as it ought to be, and we tried very hard to shift that. And that's a legacy, I think, that the university has had for some time, I'm sorry to say.
That as the leader of the institution, it is leadership that dictates or directs an institutional culture, and it may have had that for some time, but you weren't just there a couple of months. There was perhaps time to shift that, and yet it appears to have got worse.
I'm not sure if it got worse or not, but certainly I tried to shift it, I think, was me trying to be open and visible and engaged. Okay. And I probably didn't make as much progress on that as I would have liked to have. Two final questions, if I may. Who took the decision to advertise for a rector's assessor using a recruitment agency rather than use the established practice where the appointment is in the gift of the rector in discussion with the Students' Association? Goodness me, that's a detailed question. Well, the issue was dealt with by the University Secretary's office. So it would be the University Secretary and the Deputy University Secretary who So you weren't involved in that decision, as far as you can recall? I'm sure there was a discussion with saying this is what we're going to do, and I said, well, why are you going to do it? But I don't recall. Okay. I don't recall the specifics of it. Okay. In the Gillies report, and this is a quote, there is this very clear statement: the failure of the university's financial governance system was self-inflicted and experienced multiple times and at multiple levels. That's the quote. Who should pay for the self-inflicted failure? Sorry, could you... Who should pay for the self-inflicted failure? What do you mean by who should pay? Well, but I've paid, and I've lost my job, but that was you might all say that's not enough, but that's...
Lost your job with 6 months' salary. That's
contractual.
cold comfort to the nearly 700 people who still have the threat of compulsory redundancies hanging over them. That's 700 people who have devoted a lot of their time to the institution, lived in Dundee and the wider region as well. It's, you know, that's not just devastating for those individuals, that's devastating for the city and the wider communities too. Should they pay? Is that fair?
Well, I think I've answered the question, and that I've paid by taking responsibility and leaving.
Okay. Thank you.
We're 2.5 hours into our committee meeting, and other members are now going to come in. Everyone's had a chance to speak. But I'm sat here listening to you, looking at you, and something that's just coming to me is, what's your strategy today? What did you come in here to achieve, and do you think you are and will achieve it?
So my strategy today was to come in and be as open and as honest as I can be, but to accept the fact that there are some things, elements of detail that I don't recall.
Do you think you've been as open and as honest as you can be?
Yes.
It's not the view from this side, anyway.
I'm sensing that.
Yeah, you've had to be challenged a few times. You've had to update your evidence. OK, let's get back to some of the other issues. Gillies report. Do you know how many times it says the principal could have been aware, should have been aware, or was aware? How many times is that sentence repeated in the Gillies report?
I haven't counted it, but many.
12 times. I counted it. Didn't take me long. Now, I would have thought, if I'm the principal, and this is a report largely about my leadership, I would look to see how many times a phrase like that is included. Do you just not care?
Well, I think you're misreading this. I care very, very deeply. And like all of my colleagues who sat on this side of the inquiry, and I appreciate this is cold comfort. I appreciate this. This is extremely painful for all of us. Extremely painful to read, extremely painful to reflect, extremely painful to understand the level of our failure. And that's what you're seeing here, is someone who is feeling a great deal of pain and a great deal of regret, and is very, very, very apologetic for the way we ran the affairs of the university. It's not caring, it's quite the opposite.
That's probably the furthest you've gone in over 2.5 hours of evidence, and I wonder why it takes us that long to get that amount of contrition from you. But the reason I asked that particular point about how often it's repeated in the report is because throughout your evidence today you have tried to blame the information you were provided, that you were not given the proper facts and figures to see these issues occurring on the horizon, to stop them happening, or to promptly deal with them. But Gillies says 12 times you could have, should have, or were aware. How do you respond to that?
Well, should have, I have to accept there are many things I should have done, but did not. Could have, similarly, were aware. Well, being aware and understanding implications are not the same thing. I think what I read into the reports is that our financial management across our university and our team was very poor, including mine. And so is there contrition for that? Yes, there's deep contrition for that.
But Pamela Gillies is saying this in light of all the evidence provided, in light of seeing what you were provided by finance teams, by interim and full finance directors, from your chief operating officer, from your deputy vice-chancellor. She knew all the information you were provided, and she still says 12 times you, the principal, should have, could have, and would have been aware of these things. But you're telling us today that on many of these occasions you weren't.
Well, I'm telling you today that on many of these occasions I did not understand the implications of some of that material.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And further to your line of questioning, I wanted to return to what is a huge black hole in the reporting to the Scottish Funding Council. So, were you aware of the duties for your organisation to report the financial strain the organisation was under?
So my understanding of my obligations was not detailed. And I relied upon, I'll be honest, I relied upon my finance function and my governance function to advise me on when we should be communicating with the Scottish Funding Council.
And at what point were you aware of needing to then provide that information? Only at the very end, when you were, the letter I have here, the principals asked that I drop you a line. Was that from your chief operating officer? Is that the point at which you were aware of all these duties?
I think my understanding of what we needed to be, that we had real financial issues, including around the covenants that we needed to report to the Scottish Funding Council for things that hadn't been done, was near the end. That's true.
And this is where, you know, reading Professor Gillies' report, she and the investigation team have obviously found it really difficult to get this paper trail, and states the principal either was made aware or should have been made aware of potential breaches of judgment and whether or not to report this to SFC. It feels like a lot of this information was not being then written down for them to be able to access, and maybe it was conversations which you say you prefer having. Is that a fair judgment that these conversations were being had with other professionals? You expected them to take this work forward, and I suppose, have you ever asked the Chief Operating Officer to limit information being sent to the Scottish Funding Council or anyone else in the institution? So
the last question, absolutely categorically not. Absolutely categorically not. Your comment, I prefer conversations.
You said that yourself. Yeah.
I like conversations. I do like to explore things. In terms of what I knew and what I should have known...
Doesn't really work for financial management of institutions, though, does it?
Well, it's a failure then.
Absolutely. And so the information which she was trying to seek in the time she spent with you, you have no diaries of any of these conversations, because it's, I think the Scottish Funding Council, if they'd been aware, could have really acted as that canary in the mine moment instead of where we've got to. And it feels like there was probably some sort of cover-up to stop organisations externally wanting that information to be aware of them internally within the university. Is that a fair comment?
Can I ask you to repeat that, please?
Reading the report, if the Scottish Funding Council had been aware much early on, I think action and processes would have kicked in quite early. And government awareness as well, to be quite frank. It feels like that's something you didn't want, or the university senior management clearly would have not wanted to happen. And we can't get to the bottom then of who was covering that up, stopping that flow of information. And I don't know if it was you, because you were out of the country by the looks of things most of the time, but the team of senior management must have been sharing this cash flow information. How many times a week did you ever meet with your chief operating officer? Was that just when you were back in the country, a brief meeting? Or this is like, I can't understand why none of that information is not available.
Yeah. So I was unaware of the information. I should have been aware of it. It's on me that I wasn't aware of it, but I wasn't aware of it. As far as meeting the Chief Operating Officer was concerned, I had weekly meetings with the Chief Operating Officer and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. And I would see the Chief Operating Officer more frequently than that because we were on the same floor. If there was any...
And at no point was breach of covenants being raised?
The very first time that breach of covenants was raised was the conversation that I've already reported to you, which was me with Peter Fotheringham, with Shane O'Neill, in my office after Peter had indicated his departure, and it was a general catch up with him prior to his departure. I was having more catch ups with him, and I raised the question, "Tell me about our covenants."
And what
that
date
was the first time.
The date you're suggesting that was
Well, end of September, beginning of October, roughly 2 weeks before the finance
of 2024.
And policy. Yes, exactly. I can't remember the exact date.
And that whole period from July 23 to then, you weren't, you weren't involved. Never a mention of anything
on covenants. No, the first conversation.
Pretty amazing.
The very first conversation, and as I said to you before, in the Gillies report, talking about the covenant issue the year before, I had no awareness of that.
So all the questions my colleague Michael Mara put to you about clearly the money running out at some point, no point did you start to say, where are we with the creditors? Or you weren't aware of the concern that clearly they had?
If I go back to my answer to Mr Mason, when he asked the question, how much did you pay attention on covenants, I think it's, if my recollection is correct, what I said was we weren't paying that much attention to covenants because I had not properly understood the responsibility on covenants for a rolling credit facility that we weren't drawing on. And therefore, I asked the question of the finance director to educate me on this. And back to one of the points you made earlier, where were my areas of I think you said weakness. In this case, I'd say ignorance. That was one of them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
To then follow on from that point, one of the issues, again, that we went into some detail yesterday, but you're not aware of it because you didn't watch, was the lack of management accounts going to the University Executive Group. So periods 9, period 10 and period 11 were produced in draft but never finalised into papers that reached the University Executive Group. You were the chair of the University Executive Group, correct?
Correct.
So why did these papers appear in draft but not to your group and the membership of the group?
Again, I was constantly pushing at Finance Directorate to bring management accounts to the group. And
so Peter Fotheringham disobeyed you?
Sorry?
Peter Fotheringham disobeyed you?
Well, I think pushing for something in an organisation like a university and delivering an instruction which is obeyed or not obeyed are two different things. I was pushing for something.
So if it happens once, you're not happy. It then happens again and again. I'm sorry, I don't believe you that you were constantly asking for this and you accepted they were never coming to your group. Why didn't they come? Just tell us honestly.
Because they weren't being prepared by finance.
There
was no attempt from me or anybody in the group to hold anything back.
They were in draft. They were prepared in draft.
Sorry,
they were prepared in draft. Gillies said, page 33 of her report, period 9, 10 and 11 management accounts, April, May, June 2024, were produced in draft but never finalised into papers that reached the University Executive Group. It is not clear why this happened or who decided that these papers would not be provided. They were there in draft. So why weren't they provided?
So my understanding was that the papers were prepared in draft by one of our colleagues in Finance Department for her director to produce to UEG. And I didn't know that these were being prepared in draft and not coming until after Peter Fotheringham had left.
Well, you did, because they didn't appear.
Yeah, but I didn't know they were prepared in draft.
But you must have been wondering where they were, because you had them for period 7.
I was wondering where they were, and I said, when are we going to get them? Soon. Can we get them sooner, please?
I spent several hours over the last couple of days with you and Peter Fotheringham. I cannot believe that if you, as the Principal and Vice-Chancellor, were asking Peter Fotheringham for something, that he would not provide that.
Well, I think there's...
certainly not over a course of 3 months.
I sometimes struggled to get papers out of
Were you worried about what was in those draft papers and you didn't want them going to the University Executive Group?
No, absolutely not. Because, as we discussed before, I forget who it was who asked me, I think it was maybe Mr Mason, did I have conversations with Peter about what was in the management accounts before they went to UEG, and my answer to that was no, I didn't. I think I should have done, and that would have helped on the issue, where are they? Show me them, Peter, let's put them to UEG. But I didn't, and what came to UEG is what came to UEG.
We'll go to John Mason now.
Thanks. Yeah, just kind of on that point, the suggestion was made yesterday that maybe the finance department was under-resourced, and as the university had grown, presumably more work, was that a discussion or something you were aware of, or were you ever asked for more resources for the finance department?
So the part of the finance department that was discussed with me was research finance, which is the finance department that deals with incomings and outgoings for research grants. And that was an area of the finance department that was regarded as being weak and needing reform. And that was something that I come from a research background, so I pushed at that. But beyond that, around treasury functions and functions with the individual business units, when I asked the question, do you have sufficient resources, the answer was yes. So I wasn't getting, we're hugely under-resourced, you need to help us.
Mm-hmm. Because I think we got the impression there was some long-term sickness and that kind of thing, so they seem to have felt under pressure. If the finance director had wanted one or two more staff for the finance department, how would they have gone about that? Would they come to you or the chief operating officer, or how would that work? So
normally it would be a paper that would go to the so-called PRG, the committee which looked at resource expenditure, and that was one in which it was the coup and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor chaired it.
Okay. I mean, if the finance director was working, say, into the evenings and things, because if the finance director was working in the evenings or weekends because they were under pressure, would you have known that? Would you have picked that up?
Only if it told me.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Camilla.
Omara.
Thank you, Camilla. I mean, this has been a catalogue of incompetence. I mean, could have, should have, littered throughout today. Your successor, Shane O'Neill, has now left his post as principal because he's deemed to have been complicit in the debacle of your leadership and what's happened. Your predecessor, Andrew Atherton, but one, there was a small interim period within that, also had to leave the position. Do you think that there is some form of structural problem that we can't get proper leadership for this outstanding group of staff and students?
Well, I think a lot of the structural problems are about people, me, others, and many have left. So if we look at the University of Dundee now, there's almost no one on the executive group now that was there when I was there. I think in terms of the university itself, it's a university which has accumulated bits over the last few years, and it's very, 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 and we've talked about this a lot, we've talked about this, Michael, here, and we've talked about it many times before, it's very asymmetrical in its performance. And
so are you saying it's a job that people don't want to do because it's too difficult? Not to put final point on it, is that why we ended up with you?
Well, I think you'd have to ask the ex-chair of court, Ronnie Bowie, why they ended up with me. I think it is. I think it's difficult to attract people into an organisation which is financially challenged, is as asymmetric as Dundee is, and has gone through not just 17 senior staff, but quite a number of principals in the last few years. And I think that's an effort that colleagues in court and beyond, perhaps MSPs, I think you going out there and finding a really outstanding leader for the future of that fantastic university is something that I think all of you need, if you can, to collaborate in.
The XCNC money, so a more detailed point. At what point were you told or did you realise that that money had been spent? £40 million.
Yeah. My assumption was, and everybody else on UEG and Court's assumption, was it was ring-fenced. Of course, there was nowhere on the accounts it was ring-fenced, and we should have seen it wasn't ring-fenced. The government, both management and governance, should have seen that. But it was maybe a delusional act of belief that it was. And so the point at which I understood it was gone was the day of the court meeting where I revealed that.
So what day was that? Give us a month even.
Oh, November.
November. Because there was information in the Finance and Policy Committee papers of 21st of May that show the monies were no longer ring-fenced and they were formed part of the year-end cash. Were you aware of that at the time?
I missed that at the time.
You missed that?
Yes, I missed it. Yeah.
And essentially what, yesterday, we had this exchange yesterday with Jim McGeorge, who said he also didn't realise that the money had been spent. And Peter Fotheringham said, it's a surprise to me that anybody doesn't know. The university was never generating enough cash to spend on its fixed assets programme itself. Well, so yourself and the Chief Operating Officer were spending, well, hand over fist, money flying out the door on staff and capital. That's clear in the Gillies report, Professor. You know, it's a wry smile there, but that's the clear pattern of behaviour from you all.
It's a grimace of pain. It's true.
But you didn't have the money to pay for it, and you had been told in May, and you just hadn't read it, that that money had gone. Where did you think the money was coming from?
So, I'll say again, none of us around the executive group, save Peter Fotheringham, none of us around the executive group understood that that money had gone.
But it was in the report, though. It'd been, so it wasn't a case of the
I'm not
report
denying
hadn't
it was
been
in the
produced.
report.
It had been sent to you all.
We didn't see it.
But there was emergency away days from UEG in spring where you were talking about the financial situation. At that point, you didn't think to inquire about any of this?
We never discussed that XCNC money.
Okay.
This is extraordinary. You just said the first you knew that 40 million had been blown, was no longer ring-fenced, was the day of the meeting where you told the court of the 35 to 40 million pound shortfall. So you woke up that morning thinking you were going to go to court and tell them everything was fine. And between waking up and going to the court, you found out you'd lost 40 million pounds. That's your evidence? That's not credible. It's not.
Well, but it's true. I came into the office and I had the interim finance director. The interim finance director had spent the weekend going through the numbers in great detail, and she and some of her team and the chief operating officer came into my office and said, "We've got some news that you're really not going to like." I said, "Okay, tell me the news." And the XCNC money's gone. The deficit for the university isn't the 1.2 million that was written in the short reports going to Finance and Policy Committee. Look, if you look far enough into the annual report, which I hadn't done because I looked only at the introduction, it's 12.1 million deficit, and we have a very significant hole in our funds going forward. And as unbelievable as that is the truth.
So you left the university on Friday. You had a weekend at home thinking your challenge as Principal and Vice-Chancellor was to save £1.2 million because that was your deficit. And you went in on Monday morning, and I assume you mean Helen Simpson,
yes,
told you that no, it was somewhere between 35 and 40 million.
No, that's not what I said. You asked me about the XCNC money, and specifically the XCNC money. I wasn't aware of that. The £1.2 million deficit the previous year, as I had understood it, because that was what the summary papers coming forward was saying, was 12.1. And I had already worked out, because we'd done it with the University Leadership Group prior to Helen coming, that we had a, I don't remember the exact number, a £35 million hole, which I had told the Chair of Court.
But you were relatively... you were of the belief that you still had 40 million, which, although ring-fenced, you could maybe use to fill some of these gaps. And then you were told it had all gone.
Correct.
Okay. I'll take Willie Rennie, then Joe Fitzpatrick.
No, I'm fine, convener.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks. I'm just trying to get the understanding of the numbers, and we've got this piece of paper in terms of the draft audit, where you'd handwritten on in terms of the introduction to that paper, in terms of the auditor's work to try and change some of the words. At the very bottom of it, it says clearly, and this goes back to the 23-24, adjusting for non-recurring items, the underlying operational position is a deficit of 11.5. So I'm just not understanding how the urgency, wasn't it, when we're hearing 1.2, and then actually in that document it's talking about 11.5 million. So how you're not aware of, because it's there in black and white, and you haven't tried to change that bit.
I haven't tried to change anything. Sorry, in terms of a narrative. Yeah. I beg your pardon. So the Finance Director's report to Finance and Policy Committee and to Court talked about a 1.2, forgive me, maybe 1.3, £1.2 million operating deficit for the year. And that's a number that I and the executive group had fixed on. And we failed to read into the detail of the overall accounts and see that number. And it is a failure, one of many.
I'm just not understanding how, when you have something from the auditors, which you've written on, so you've definitely read this, flagging the 11.5, you could think that all of a sudden that there's less rather than more, in spite of the 40 million that managed to disappear without anybody in the executive team's awareness. I hope you can understand how this is really difficult for all of us to understand, how, given that there is so much information which we can now see from the evidence that we've got, you did have, to say that things aren't adding up to the figure that you've got. How could you get to the point that it was 1.2 when everything is saying this is much, much worse than that?
I of course I understand, and I look at the forensic analysis done by Pamela and our colleagues, and if I had one wish in the world, it's that I had commissioned that 18 months ago. But that didn't happen, and I'm explaining to you what we believed, which was clearly wrong, and even though we had material which we simply didn't have the time and the bandwidth to read through in enough detail, because we trusted the team to be presenting accurately what was going on. And that is a failure.
I have to draw this to a close because we have to be concluded before parliamentary business begins in the chamber, but I want to put a couple of final points to you. In response to Miles Briggs, you said you were honoured to be appointed to a great university. After 4 years of Ian Gillespie being in charge, was it still a great university?
It's still a great university. It's a great university with many challenges.
Caused by you?
That my team and I have produced many negatives towards it. It's also won University of the Year a couple of times. It's improved. It improved its rankings. It sank and it came back up again. It's improved student satisfaction. It's done many, many, many good things. It should have been able to do greater things, and I take the responsibility for that not being the case.
I'm certainly sure it will go on to continue to be a great university, but it will be in spite of rather than because of your time in charge. Secondly, I started by asking, and several others did, about you paying back the £150,000 plus that you got as a payoff for leaving. You said you'd reflect on it. This will perhaps be the last time we hear from you in public, certainly in a setting like this. Would you like a final opportunity to say on reflection of the questions you've been asked over the last 3 hours, do you think it's right that you hand back that money? You don't deserve it.
I've said to the committee, and I'll say it again, I'll take that away and I'll reflect on it with my family.
Okay. And finally, having read the entire report, having read everything that has been written about this, having listened to staff and students, whistleblowers coming forward to reveal some of the graphic detail about what went on, I'm led to only 2 final conclusions. You were either incompetent or corrupt. Which was it?
Certainly not corrupt, so I have to choose incompetent.
Okay. I'm grateful for your time today. I understand this won't have been easy. I hope in some ways you've been able to put your side of the arguments, and it's for others to judge the merits or otherwise of what you have told us, what other witnesses have told us. But certainly this is something that had to be thoroughly investigated and interrogated. You have been part of that by making yourself available today. So for that, I thank you. I thank members for their patience this week, which has been very busy for the committee and education-wise in the chamber. And I therefore conclude this meeting and close this meeting of the committee. Thank you.